Hello, welcome everyone who's just joining us on this lovely Wednesday night evening. This is a very exciting debate this evening. It's basically our annual collaboration with a student economics review, and this is a competitive debate where we have students from not only Trinity, but also Yale competing against each other on the motion this House would implement universal basic income, economics themed, obviously. But yeah, thank you all for joining us this evening, and I'll just run straight into the debate, or no, sorry, this evening's business. I should explain first, though, that there's two parts this evening, basically because we are an old student society. We do private business, which is like the inner workings of the society. We go through a couple of questions. It's relatively quick, and then we go straight into public business, which is the actual debate. But again, thank you to everyone who's joining us. Apologies for us being a little bit late. But without further ado, I'd like to call upon Catherine Kelly to chair private business.
I call this House to order and call upon the Record Secretary to read the minutes of the last private business meeting.
The last private business meeting took place on the 24th of March 2021 with Rosie Joyce in the chair. There were no fines, no reports to be read, no motions on notice, and no motions not on notice.
Are there any objections to my virtually signing these minutes as a true and accurate reflection of the last private business meeting? Then I shall duly sign. And then I'm going to cede the floor back to the auditor.
Excellent. Now I'm just going to ask a series of questions to my officers. So first and foremost, Madam Treasurer, are there any fines?
There are no fines.
Excellent. On to Madam Pro Librarian. Could you open question time?
The time for questions is now open.
Excellent. So if anyone has any questions on the running of the society, whether it be about our upcoming elections or just about the events that we're holding, feel free to ask them in the chat or in the Q&A function. I'll give you about like 30 seconds to type it out. The suspense always kills me at this point in the debate. Harney's final. Oh yes, might as well use this opportunity to plug our upcoming events. But next week at this very time, we have the Harney's final. So the Harney's is a women and non-binary open competition. This year we've opened it up to all universities across Ireland. It's been very big, and next week is the final. So very exciting. We have 8 wonderful speakers for that debate, and I encourage all you guys to come along to it. But yeah, excellent question, Martha. But yeah, without further ado then, Marie, or Madam Pro Librarian.
The time for questions is now closed.
Excellent. Okay, moving on to Mr. Record Secretary. Are there any reports to be read?
There are no reports to be read.
Are there any motions on notice?
Yes, there are 2 motions on notice, one proposed by Breed O'Donnell and another proposed by Judith Annan. Excellent.
So I'll take this opportunity to read out my motion. Motion to reward the officers of the 250th session, marked thanks of the society, proposed by myself, seconded by Julie Leanne. Julie?
Yeah, do you want me to second that or read the other motion?
Read the other motion.
So yeah, I'm proposing a motion to elect the following ex-officers to honorary membership of the society. Pierce Sinnott, ex-SMC, Claire, Senior Member of Committee, Claire Elwell, ex-Senior Member of Committee, Conor O'Malley, ex-Member of Committee, Kayleigh Newcomb, ex-Correspondence Secretary, Anya Curry, ex-Treasurer, and Niall Maher, ex-Events Convener. And that's proposed by myself and seconded by Laura Green.
Excellent. Those motions are on notice and will be voted upon next week. And then finally, Mr. Record Secretary, are there any motions not on notice?
There are no motions not on notice.
Perfect. And then finally, Madam Treasurer, are there any fines?
Nobody has managed to accrue any fines in the last 5 minutes, Breed, so there are still no fines.
Thank God. Okay, then I'd like to cede the floor back to the chair.
And I would like to call this House adjourned.
Whew. So that's private business over and done with, and we can move on now to public business. So without further ado, I'm delighted to call upon Natalie Bennett to chair public business for this evening.
Thank you very much, and it's delightful to be with you. I call this House to order and call upon the Record Secretary to read the minutes of the last public business meeting.
So I, like many of you, I'm a student. I, like many of you, have deadlines, and I, like many of you, tend to leave those deadlines to the very last second. This week alone, I had 5 assignments due, and rather than get them done timely within the 3 months that I had, I decided to leave it towards the last minute, as we all do, because that bit of pressure makes sure you get the job done. And so the night, I think last night, or was it the night before last, I didn't go to sleep. I can't remember because I didn't sleep. I stayed up the entire night working on an essay, and at around 7 o'clock or so, 7:30 in the morning, I decided, you know what, I'm still up, I might as well have breakfast. And so I treated myself to something I haven't had in a long, long time, a bowl of Cheerios. And in my delirium, I think I started to wonder where exactly Cheerios came from and how are they made. And so I did a bit of research into it. And I'll tell you what I discovered. Now, don't be fooled. They are not, in fact, a wheaty, delicious treat. Cheerios are, to put it in a politically correct sense, beings from an alternate dimension. So this alternate dimension is called Cheerio Land, and in Cheerio Land they have a kind of a segregated society based on wealth, and so they effectively have 5 classes of Cheerio, and the very top, the cream of the crop, are the frosted Cheerios. So at the bottom you kind of have the lower level, we'll just call them, you know, the Teen Zero kind of Cheerios. And there's this poor Cheerio chap on this level. Unfortunately, he's homeless. He doesn't have a job, and unfortunately can't afford a house or an apartment. The poor fella is living on the streets. But one day he falls in love with this frosted Cheerio princess, and he manages to sneak himself into the royal gala. And he's bold as brass, I tell you, because he goes right up to her and he says, "Mrs. Princess, would you marry me?" And she says, "Well, all right, fella, I like your style. You're good looking. You're a little bit scruffy, but you're up front. I tell you what, I'll marry you if you can become a frosted Cheerio." So our friend, the zero hero, he goes with a determination back to the streets. He finds himself a job. He starts to pay off these debts. And now that he has a job and he has his debts paid, he becomes a level 1 Cheerio. You know, so he's working as hard as he can. He works and works and works, and finally he becomes a level 2 Cheerio. And now, so he goes back to the princess and he asks her, "Will you marry me yet?" And she says, "No, I'm sorry, honey. You really have to become a frosted Cheerio first." So he goes back, he works more, he works and works. He's a fry boy at McDonald's, handling the filet-o-fishes. I think that's how the Americans pronounce them. I don't know. So he works and he works. He gets promoted at McDonald's. He's making more money. He's working and working and working. And by having that income from his raise, his pay raise, he finally becomes a level 3 Cheerio. He feels successful for the first time in his life. But he's starting to fall back into his old ways. One day he goes to the Cheerio casino, and he loses. He loses pretty badly. He loses a lot of his money on the horses, and so he gets booted out and ends up losing his job because gambling is against company policy. And so he's back down to being a level 1 Cheerio. And so he ends up getting a job on the production line at a nearby factory, and he makes a promise to himself he will not fall down again. So he works and he works and he works. Level 2, level 3, he's back on the horse. He's doing great again. He gets promoted to floor manager of the factory. He's doing great. He's working, gets to level 4, and then one day a rival company sabotages their operation by putting poison in the toothpaste. It's a toothpaste factory, by the way. And so they have to pay out damages, and there's a PR meltdown and the like. They have to declare bankruptcy. So he gets knocked back down to level 2 for the lack of income. But he gets hired almost straight away by a branch of this huge conglomerate, because they recognized how hard a worker that he really is. So he works, level 3, level 4, he works and works and works, gets promoted to CEO of a huge company. He becomes a level 5 Cheerio. He's making Bill Gates money now, and finally he becomes a frosted Cheerio. So he goes to the princess and he asks her, listen, I'm finally a frosted Cheerio, will you marry me? And she says, yes, I will marry you. So a few months pass and they're at their wedding reception. They've already said their vows, the party's winding down. And so the newlywed wife tells her husband, here, I'm thirsty, would you go over to the bar and get me a gin and tonic? So brand new husband, he does his duty, he goes over to the bar, and lo and behold, the bartender, he wasn't there. So he waits a bit longer, he waits, he keeps waiting, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 25, and the bartender still hasn't showed up. So he's decided he must have gone home since the party's starting to wind down at this stage. He goes back to his wife and he tells her, the bartender's not there, is there anything else you'd like? She says, okay, how about this? Go get me a Diet Coke out of the vending machine in the hotel lobby. So he goes and he gets it, and there's a bit of a line for the machine. And it was her wedding after all, so there's a lot of people there. You know, a lot of people showed up. So he waits and he waits, and he's in line and he's waiting, and he finally gets to the machine, only to find out the prices were jacked up because they knew they could gouge them at a wedding. He goes back to his wife to get a loan of a few more quid. Goes back, there's a new line, and he's waiting and waiting and waiting in line, only to find that once he's reached the front, they're out of Diet Coke. So he buys a regular Coke instead, and he takes it to his wife. But she throws it away because she needs, I don't know, a Diet Coke, something like that. And she tells him to get her a cup of coffee, a cup off the table, and to just get some water for her. So he goes over there, there's a line there too, so he waits and waits and waits in line. The cooler runs out of water, and there's still people ahead of him in the line, so he gives up. He goes back to his wife and tells her, look, they're out of water. Is there any other source of liquid that you'd be willing to drink? And so she tells him, screw it, just go get me some punch from the punch bowl. And so he leaves, he gets the punch, back within a minute. She says, Jesus, that was fast. What happened? How'd you get it? And he says, well, it was pretty simple. Actually, it was quite a short wait because there was no punchline. And that, my friends, is how you filibuster. Take that, Mitch McConnell.
Well, coming in as chair, I have to say that I think I might have to use that as inspiration for my next speech in the Financial Services Bill in the House of Lords. We'll see if we can get the Cheerios in there, and the boom and bust would seem to fit in quite well. But anyway, going back to the formalities, are there any objections to my signing these minutes as a true and accurate account of the last public business meeting? I'll take that as a no then. That would seem to be reasonable. And I'll pick up my pen and duly virtually sign those minutes. Okay, I should now like to call on the SER Debates Manager to introduce the invited guests to the House.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I'm very pleased to introduce not only our 4 lovely judges, and Chair Natalie, of course, but also our 3 Yale speakers. The SER has a long history and tradition of collaborating with both the HIST and the PHil and other universities across the world, primarily England and the States, and economic conversations. And so I'm very happy to introduce you all and to get this debate started. So thank you very much.
Okay, I should now like to call upon the Correspondence Secretary to explain the standing orders for tonight's debate.
Hello, thank you very much. So as this is a competitive debate between our 2 wonderful teams from Trinity and Yale, speeches will be slightly longer this evening, so speeches are 10 minutes in length for each of the speakers, with the first and last minute protected as usual, and POIs may be offered after the first minute by members of the opposing team. but there will be no POIs from members of the audience this evening because it is a competitive debate. We will also have floor speeches after the debate, who I'm sure will gladly accept POIs from the audience. The debate will be judged by our panel of judges. So following the conclusion of the speeches, they'll be adjourning to a separate Zoom call to judge the debate. And at that point, we'll have the floor speeches and some other words from people. We'll also have an opinion poll from the audience as per usual, though the judge's decision is the one that actually matters in this case. And we also have oratory returns this evening, so I'll be sending a link for those into the chat in just a moment. But oratory returns are just a way for you to let us know how speakers did, so that we can award our medals for oratory at the end of the year, which is really important to reward people who put a lot of work into their chamber speeches. So that's all for me, and I'll cede the floor back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Maggie. And I hope everyone was listening closely to those rules. It was reminding me of the first debate I ever participated in as a debater like this, which was with Edwina Curry at the Oxford Union. And when she was dinged for her 10 minutes, she just ignored it, kept talking. She was double dinged, she ignored it. The third time, the poor student officer dinged her, Edwina Curry marched around the table, snatched the bell off the table and just kept talking. So I guess Zoom doesn't allow that, which is probably a good thing. But anyway, moving on to the formal parts of things. The question before the House this evening is, this House would implement a universal basic income. And I should now like to call on Kevin Hamill to propose the motion to the House.
Thank you very much. Can I check just for, technology and all? Am I audible? Splendid. Both a blessing and a curse, I imagine. Okay. All right, just give me two seconds. I'm setting up a personal timer so that I don't engage in the very mistake you just outlined. 3, 2, 1. Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, we live in terrible, terrible times, and never before have I felt so much responsibility and so much weight upon my shoulders when I'm engaging in an economic, social, political discussion. I have watched my family, my friends, those that I care about really deeply lose their jobs. I have seen people's lives destroyed and mental health crises ravage my community. I come from a place in Northern Ireland, literally colloquially referred to as the Murder Triangle, one of the most economically deprived regions of the North. And I have watched the utter and totalizing devastation that COVID has racked across not just my community, but all of the communities that I walk through as I now live in Dublin, and I see the suffering of those around me. And I think that what's important to note in this debate is that for many, and I hope that this tragedy is short, I hope that we don't have to live through this forever, and there is hope on the horizon, but I think what we have to acknowledge and what we have to note is that for many, the suffering and the trepidation and the insecurity and the fear that they feel dogs them every day of their lives. The precariat that when, like many of us, get to escape the awful economic harms that this tragedy has wreaked upon us, they will have to live on, and they will have to live in the state that this recession has reduced so many of us to. And what I think the heart of this debate is that whilst it might seem to many like an impossibility, there has never been a more pertinent, there has never been a more important, and there has never been a more relevant time to step beyond the realm of impossibilities and consider any option and any alternative that might solve the terrible, looming, and previously unimaginable crisis that ravaged all of us. Now, I'm not going to talk solely in times of crisis. I'm going to speak from a position of feasibility. I'm going to speak from a position of what is economically possible and pragmatically relevant, but I think that what we have to engage with is that economic reality for so many is so terrible. And when we solve that, when we redress these issues, when we give people some security, because this is not a panacea, this policy, but if we mitigate that to some extent, if we help the poorest and most vulnerable to some degree, and indeed protect those that fall into their ever-growing numbers, that is an essential consideration in this debate. How do we think this will play out, and what do we think that this will look like? Now, note panel, this is a debate that is relatively short. We can't cover every form of universal basic income, of which there are a multitude. And many different countries, many different economies, many different nations will find different paths to it. But I think the most reasonable way to consider this, the one that I think is probably most universal to the majority of contexts, is that of the minimum basic income, which keeps the majority of individuals above the poverty line of their given state. The reason that I think that this is particularly important is because this is already accessible to the majority of nations on Earth, those that pump huge amounts into welfare systems that underpin their societies. This is to some degree affordable. The second thing that I would like to outline is this would be part of your taxable income most likely, i.e. this is still subject to things like progressive tax and income rates and things like that, which means that we probably don't get the caricature of universal basic income, which is so obviously and extraneously painted to so many as giving money to billionaires who make up an incredibly small proportion of the population anyway, and is obviously an absurd far-right dog whistle. The third thing that I would need to note, and this comes from pre-existing research by individuals like Guy Standing, by Anna Trevor, by Ricky T. Ross, these would probably take the form of sovereign wealth funds, or the source of this money would probably broadly arise from that. To clarify, this already exists in places like Alaska, where we have the Alaska Fund, Norway, where we have the Norwegian Fund, and it is calculated by economist Guy Standing that had the UK implemented this in 10, 12, 20 years ago, we would have the ability to pay substantially higher than the minimum basic income that we would have within this economy. This is not a debate about giving out money for free. This is a debate about redistributing the spoils of wealth that everyone in every given society is owed from birth. Why then is this feasible following from this, or why is this wealth fund, leaning on existing research, something that the vast majority of individuals can afford, and how is it likely to play out? I think there's three ways that this is likely to play out. Firstly, it probably does look like things like new taxes on those assets like carbon, those assets like technology, those assets like land, which specifically yield incredibly high returns, broadly speaking, rentier incomes, but are under the status quo, broadly not taxed. Secondly, I think what's incredibly important to note is that given pre-existing welfare like systems exist, we're not going to be completely unreasonable, panel. We're not like eye in the sky lunatics. We recognize that there will be some reallocation from existing welfare services or existing welfare funds to create this or construct this under the status quo. We probably have to accept some trade-off, some loss, but we recognize and think that this is something that is specifically feasible in that context, given it already exists, given it requires some degree of movement, some degree of change. Thirdly, we think that we already exist within progressive tax systems, and we would ideally like, and we hope, because there's rising political pressure from this among vast majorities of individuals who are tired of places like Panama, large numbers of MPs in Parliament and such that are incredibly irritated. We hope that we could close the loopholes that already exist under the status quo, and hope that there will be greater political will. We think this is likely in the context of things like Europe cracking down, quite frankly, on Ireland's status as a tax hub and stuff like that. And we think that as those supranational powers lobby more and more for this, note that they don't exist in a vacuum. They will likely use alternative means and other political pressures to, over time, close these. We think that all the already existing massive pool of wealth that exists under the status quo will likely fund this. But irrespective, given that this is a minimum basic income, at least in the short term, we think that that is an incredibly reasonable thing to do. Now, proceeding from this, and I think that on the feasibility thing, why is there a need for this? And again, this draws from the works of notable economists like Stiglitz and Piketty, who point out these trends, but are echoed by a multitude more. I think there are 5 main problems that arise and create the need for this, and to an incredibly proximate degree. Firstly, the rising inequality that exists under the status quo, as a large amount of wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few. Broadly, things like, the rise of the billionaire class, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, but that's simplistic. Secondly, and probably more importantly, the increase in existence of the precariat, those with whom they have no job security, no support, and frankly, this is largely as a consequence of the decline in union membership to some extent that has existed since the 1950s and rages to this day. This has meant that large numbers of individuals are trapped on 0-hour contracts in which they can be fired any day. Large numbers of individuals exist with incredibly low wages that exceed and accept government loopholes, where many many aren't even paid the minimum wage and exist in a standard of poverty. The third thing I would note is companies, as they exist, need fewer and fewer employees in those sectors that are most profitable, like tech. Note that when Instagram was sold for 1 billion, they had 13 employees. Compare this to companies like Kodak 30 or 40 years ago that had 440,000. I think what you have to note is that the need for individuals, even beyond automation, simply by the fact that what is demanded is distinct, is becoming increasingly smaller and increasingly pressing. Fourthly, and I think this is, many people don't seem to know this, the decline in savings that has arisen post 2008, but even prior to that, as a consequence of increased debt, more people being forced onto rental markets and such because of, like, which is a constant fixed cost that they face, and many other things mean that individuals have massive declines in savings. This means that they're often massively unable to hedge for risks like recessions and can lose their jobs any day and have nothing to fall back on and fall into nigh absolute poverty. And secondly, it means that often individuals are trapped and other things like that in horrendous situations. And fifthly and finally, the very fact that our rate and our economic development, which is fantastic, don't get me wrong, I love iPhones, the skills gap is absolutely massive. And we have path-dependent systems of education, which are incredibly hard to adjust over time, that are simply not catching up, which means many individuals are not prepared. I will take Yale before I proceed and close this off. Yes?
We agree that there's too much inequality owing to unequal access to education, but why would we not then have a very progressive tax system and then use those funds, as many countries do, to subsidize education that is free, that is not universal income you can spend however you want, but that is specifically targeted towards the things that have a proven record of inequality?
I will deal with that in a moment, but what you have to acknowledge is there's a multiplicity of distinct and disparate circumstances in which many people are simply unable to access education under the status quo, and I will get onto that now, irrespective of cost. Then three final concluding points that I think will sum this up and add substantively to the debate. Firstly, current welfare systems are not suited for purpose. Many individuals are simply tied to things that make them constantly seek out jobs that pay them very, very little and often trap them in systems of inequality, meaning one, they have terrible jobs, and two, they often can seek out things like education because they have to constantly go to job interviews and accept the first job that they're given. And even if they don't do that, if they make too much money, €1 over 1,000, I think is cited in many places, you can just lose €1,000. And this is often because politicians have to justify this to their constituents, especially the middle income bracket, as a consequence of the fact that, look, realistically, they don't want to be seen as wasting money. Secondly, in the long term, as trends like automation and stuff compound the very problems that I've outlined, the reason McKinsey estimates that 50% of jobs will be automated as a consequence of small scale tasks, being able to deal with them, you're very likely to just have large numbers of people increasingly falling into poverty across all brackets in society, meaning this is a unique way to hedge for this. What this does, very simply, is gives two things. Firstly, people can spend money how they wish, as the WTO studied many years ago. They just do the things with their income that suit them best. They just make decisions that suit them and are most proximate to the issues in their lives. I would like you to bear in mind in this debate, this is a possibility that should become a probability, and I hope it will become a reality and is one tool in the toolbox I beg you to propose.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I now call upon the first speaker for the opposition, Prastik Moharaj.
Thank you very much. Let me just set up my own personal timer. All right, brilliant. Is everybody ready? And am I audible? Just checking. All right, perfect. Panel and audience, both sides can witness the horror that COVID has wreaked on the world. We acknowledge it and empathize with the economic and social to the world, most particularly those who have already been most impoverished. But let's note that this debate is not about a uniquely COVID world, nor it doesn't have to be. Even in the case where it is a COVID world, we should think about all the effects that happen, and most particularly about the opportunity cost that occurs by using UBI compared to traditional other kinds of methods that we have. UBI is a periodic payment that is paid out to individuals, which is totally universal and unconditional. Its goal is simple: to help combat the already massive wealth inequalities that exist in the world as we continue to grow. But what we show in two ways: first of all, this benefit never gets achieved, and secondly, even if this benefit does get achieved somehow, it does it way worse than conventional alternatives that do exist in the status quo. Then we should be winning this debate if we can prove those two things. So the case that you just heard from side government is one that paints this idealistic picture of a world where universal basic income actually helps those who are most affected in some way. In a COVID world, they also contend that this can be done most effectively compared to the other alternatives. But their vision could not be further from reality. On side opposition, we believe in two things: that most people don't know what is in their best interests, and secondly, that even if they did, the government is better at spending money in their interest. A UBI is individual, it is short-termist, and it is damning to any possible sort of successive welfare state. Let the government do its job and oppose the UBI. And we should be thinking specifically here, three questions that we should consider when it comes down to UBI. First, where does the money for this come from? And is that allocation truly worth it? Secondly, assume that we have obtained this money in the best way possible. How should it be spent? And who should spend it on what? And thirdly, assume that if we have spent this money in the best way possible for UBI, is this practice sustainable in the long term? I.e., even if you get the benefits out of UBI, what are the other harms that come up that side government has pretty much nicely ignored? So firstly, on the first question, where is the money coming from? Now, they kind of state that we're going to be using this on part of taxable income, but we want to go through all the options and show why even in that case, that is still very unlikely to actually occur. So there are three possible scenarios that actually could exist. First of all, increased taxes. Secondly, increased deficit spending, or in the most likely scenario, a reallocation of the budget. We're going to show why all these options are very much not practically possible, or in the best case for government side, very unproductive. On the point of taxes, it is really hard and very unproductive to increase taxes in any government. The chain of logic is very simple. People do not like politicians that want to take more of what they perceive to be their hard-earned money. Therefore, elected officials are reluctant to heighten tax rates. Moreover, even if people would be okay with a tax increase, they won't be okay with one to fund a universal basic income. They will believe that they are already paying into the system because of the existence of taxes. So they would rather keep the money that they have earned rather than it being redistributed. This mentality is reflected in the status quo measures of popular support for the implementation of UBI. And even if most people were okay with it, what side government has pretty much excluded is the fact that the rich and powerful with lobbying power have every incentive to try and block it from happening whatsoever. If UBI were to be passed by using the so-called tax increases, the progressive tax systems that they talk about that are implemented will cause these rich people to pay even more money to the government. And rich people will lobby heavily to present this, as they do currently in the status quo for other kinds of measures regarding higher taxes. Secondly, deficit spending is just no more popular. Rhetoric about placing the burden on future generations and accumulating debt that there is no plan to pay back is a hard pill to swallow. Deficit spending itself is very unpopular in governments because of this mentality, as we've seen the effects that such activities, especially in excessively laissez-faire implementations, have had on economies. It is also just bad government policy to deliberately authorize an unbalanced budget. Hence, governments and populations would be pretty much reticent to this in any way. They make the case, for example, that there's a way that we can use actually sovereign wealth funds or tax on assets like carbon that are not taxed in status quo, but they provide no solvency on the other side exactly how it's actually going to happen and what the practical chain of command is to actually get this to happen. We don't see that coming out of their side because it's totally unfeasible. This leaves the most probable way to actually get this to occur, a reallocation of the existing budget as the most likely mechanism to fund UBI. This will require taking money away from places that it is currently being spent. Class government concedes that, for example, this will be taking money away from welfare programs. Then we have to think about the opportunity cost here. Is it worth it to take money away from welfare programs? Because they never say what the comparative is between how UBI is able to solve these problems versus welfare programs. Even welfare programs have their own detriments. We contend that they are much more effective at solving these kinds of problems, or at least going to reasonable measures to solve these problems than UBI will ever be. And the most logical one, again, is welfare programs, which include food assistance, healthcare subsidization, rent and housing relief. These have empirically proven benefits on populations that cannot be accessed nearly as well under UBI system. And we'll explore this more in our next argument. Let's just take stock of where we are right now. Out of the three possible mechanisms to fund UBI, one of which they have put forward, like two of these are almost likely never going to occur, and the last, which is the most likely one, a reallocation of the existing budget, will incur a severe opportunity cost. Let's explore this now. The second question, once we have these billions of dollars to put into citizenry from where we obtain it, who should spend it, the state or the people? It might be enticing to say that people know what they need best, that they are the best manager of their money, but let's look at this, for example, that discretionary spending stimulates the economy. We say no to all of this. The state should be the executor of its own affairs. And ensuring the welfare of its people is far simpler when the government can direct funds where they are most needed. The traditional welfare system via the targeted programs is far preferable. It is better to target the poorest 20% or so than to dilute across all income classes, because diminishing marginal utility of wealth means that the 20th percentile is more than twice less well off than the 40th percentile, et cetera, et cetera. Their claim is likely that increased political capital owing to the fact that rich people also benefit from UBIs is going to solve this better. And there are 4 problems with this that we see. First, it's unlikely that this kind of increased political capital would amount to like a greater increase in total welfare, whatever you need to counteract the dilution effect. Secondly, the goalposts change. Again, the wealthier just think in terms of whether the taxes that they pay to finance the UBI exceed what they themselves could have earned from UBI or not. And insofar as that the wealthier holds, they still perceive this policy as theft, excessive theft compared to the fact that even the progressive taxes exist. Thirdly, even if they are correct that now the rich appear to benefit from this, this likely reduces support for many people. Lots of rich people like supporting welfare because it looks, selfless. For example, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates want people to think that they're willing to give up tons of their money for the poor. But if the perception, even if not that readily, is that the wealthy also benefit from this, they gain no optical advantage, no optics at all from supporting it. And since it doesn't actually benefit them, they have no reason to support it in the end. And then fourthly, wealthy people are just likely to oppose UBI for the independent reason that they perceive UBI is likely to lead to inflation. We'll talk about the realities of this later on, something that they completely miss on government to see what actually happens when under UBI. But for now, it's sufficient to note that this is a widespread concern that many people already have a UBI and counter the proposal as such. Wealthy people tend to be more inflation averse because they tend to be lenders more than borrowers, and they tend to hold lots of financial assets. These are precisely the people who lose under inflation because the real value of their assets goes down when inflation increases. We need their support to actually get this passed. If they lobby against it altogether, we don't get this passed. There's no feasibility. The upshot is that there's nowhere near enough political capital to counteract the main effect of UBI, which, as they claim, is redistributing welfare away from those who need it most. Now let's move on to the third question. Even in government's best case, where the UBI should be adopted on whatever grounds they deem fit, can you keep it? Will it last? And we say that the UBI is actually destined for failure. Now we can talk about the effects, for example, that exist with disemployment, with macro spillovers and skill decay for individual workers, that was brought up in the POI. But let's move forward to just the idea of what is actually going to cause with inflation. Transfer payments themselves are inflation, and UBI is a perfect example of transfer payments playing a role in a massive national economy. Once money begins to be spent without the exchange of tangible or abstract goods or services, and importantly, giving it all to indiscriminately everyone within an economy without specific considerations or target factors that get to be addressed, which again is in contrast to welfare programs that actually do target specific factors, then the currency of that country is led to devalue, since this creates an income increase that's reflected in each and every individual that qualifies for UBI, which by definition is universal. Before I move forward, I'll take the PR from the opposing side.
Yes, so this is all empirically untrue. The WTO tested this, and individuals that you give this amount of money for tend to seek things like education, look out for childcare, and engage in social spending. And crucially, those that are poorest, that are now able to achieve this because they're often locked out of welfare systems, are actually going to add to the US economy, for example, by 12% because they're the most likely to spend the money. Like, this is just not true.
What we see then on this idea of education or people actually going for these kind of benefits is, at best case for government side, a neutrality. Both sides can access in a wash. What we say though is that once this money goes to the people that are, as we've proven before, just by logic, short-termist and individualistic, then we cannot guarantee that benefit. Whereas the welfare programs that we've shown, we do guarantee that benefit, and we detract from this, again, this harm of inflation existing. Inflation's negative effects that we can talk to you about are straightforward. Ruin the purchasing power of money. This includes the increase in opportunity cost of holding money, et cetera, et cetera. But moreover, inflation disproportionately hurts those that are the poorest. How so? While inflation can't raise the value of illiquid investments like houses and stocks, these are overwhelmingly not accessible to the economically marginalized. They tend to own degrading investments such as cars and cash savings accounts or set pension plans. They also tend to rent, such as the value of rental properties rises, so do rents, but without the resultant equity. Rising rents create extreme house issues such as eviction crises, homelessness, gentrification, and an inability to afford down payments on mortgages to actually exit the cycle of renting. In fact, UBI and its inflationary effects actually harm those people it claims to help the most, the very population that was designed to help those who are most disproportionately marginalized. For all these reasons, very, very proud to oppose the motion of instituting a UBI. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prustik. And I now call upon the second speaker for the proposition, Ellen McHugh.
Yeah, I'm just going to set up my technology stuff. If anybody wants to offer me a POI, please shout at me. I won't see you if you put it into the chat, and at least I will have the satisfaction of saying no when you shout at me. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Adwini Isha, come and Starl and Closhta, come and do sport to Yale. Adwini Isha, thank you for the floor. And let me first say what an honour it is to be representing Trinity this evening. And I want to thank everybody who has been involved in organising such an interesting and topical debate. Before I get into the main body of my speech, I want to address a number of things that we've just heard from opposition here, because I think there's so many mischaracterizations and misunderstandings that have occurred in the last 10 minutes. So to go back to the point about like the POI about funding services, I think it's incredibly clear from our case that we do not see universal basic income as the silver bullet that's magically going to solve all of our problems. We've already stated that we will operate universal basic income in conjunction with other things like taxation, like the provision of services. There is still a role for the government in this provision. But to talk about the government as well, there's this massive inconsistency in the case brought by the opposition, where on one hand they characterise the government as being captured by the rich and always acting in their interests, but at the very same time say that the government is best placed to spend money for the benefit of the poor. Opposition can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, the government are best placed to spend money for the poor and will act in their interest, when they also argue 2 minutes beforehand that the government are captured by the rich and will always act in their interest. And also to go back to the trade-off between some rich people getting money that they don't necessarily need. I think that's a trade-off we're willing to make versus the current system where people who desperately need the financial security that universal basic income could bring are allowed to fall through the cracks of a not fit for purpose welfare system. I think that's a trade-off we're willing to make, and I don't think that's the most important question in this debate. I think the most important question in this debate, in my eyes, is why opposition are content to sacrifice lives and livelihoods on the altar of outdated economic dogmatism, which has been proven to be empirically untrue by the very many studies that we have talked about earlier. And I also want to talk about this point about inflation. That seems to be a big worry for the opposition. And I think if we're talking about inflation, we need to talk about where a lot of inflation actually comes from. So as illustrated by people like Kate Raworth, the vast majority of inflation, or at least very many of it, comes from kind of the central tenets of the financial system, wherein new money enters into the economy through commercial banks offering loans or credits, which are increasingly channeled into things like the accumulation of capital, which doesn't create new wealth, but just earns a return by pushing up the price of existing assets, thus leading to inflated prices without increased productivity or societal wealth. And if we contrast this with what we think that the scenario we're likely to see with the implementation of UBI, and as I will illustrate further, UBI represents an investment in the potential of every citizen of the state, which can enable them to contribute to society in a way that is meaningful to them. And I think this also kind of leads into the characterization of kind of short-termism, selfishness that we see from opposition. Because what we tend to see with this as well is this kind of notion that universal basic income is, to quote a Japanese parliamentary candidate, printing out fat stacks of money and handing that shit out to everyone. And I apologize to my family who are watching the debate for that language. But this characterization paints kind of an almost parasitic picture of people essentially like leeching off the government and then returning to their dens of iniquity, where they commit the mortal sin of not contributing to the economy. And according to opponents of UBI, like people don't want to work, and a handout from the government is just like a convenient way out for them. But the thing is, that's a gross simplification of the issue. And it's not that people don't want to work, at least not in general. The real problem is that increasing numbers of people are trapped in jobs that they see as meaningless and in conditions that are detrimental to their physical, emotional, and mental health. And they're trapped because of the severe power imbalance between employers and employees, which hinders workers in negotiations for better conditions. They're trapped because they lack the financial means to take the calculated risks necessary to invest in their skills and education and to find meaningful and rewarding work that contributes to the economy and to society. So just to ground what Queen has already told you about the problems within the status quo, I was going to use a quick example. So Janet is a single mother living in Alabama. She earns $15 an hour, working 10-hour shifts every day at her work in Amazon's warehouse in Bessemer. Like most of her fellow employees, Janet isn't part of a union. Janet's work is monitored at all times. She limps constantly from the extended time she spends on her feet, and she feels like she's just another machine in the warehouse. There's an accountancy night class starting in her area soon. Janet's always had a head for numbers. Maths was her favourite subject in school, and she had thought about pursuing it afterwards, but she couldn't afford to. The poster catches her eye But it doesn't matter because Janet can't afford a babysitter to look after her kids. She's only earning just enough as it is. Janet is too exhausted after her day's work to even contemplate taking on something else. So she carries on at her work and collapses on her couch in the evening, exhausted. And in the years to come, Janet's work will most likely be replaced by a machine. In fact, currently demonstrated technologies could automate 45% of the work that people are currently paid to do. And when that time comes, people like Janet will struggle to find work again because they were not able to afford to invest in their skills before it was too late. And in the time being, universal basic income offers Janet and millions of others like her the security to be able to collectively organise and negotiate better working conditions. Under our current system, the balance of power in workplace negotiations, especially in sectors where there isn't a strong history of trade unions, is weighted heavily in favour of employers because workers rely on their wages from their jobs for survival and often don't have the financial means to risk periods of unemployment if they leave their jobs or if they're fired for attempting to act collectively. It's incredibly difficult, often impossible, to negotiate better working conditions and pay, which leads to the exploitation of millions of workers every day. Their labour is extracted in order to maximise profit, and to hell with their lives, to hell with their livelihoods, to hell with their health, and to hell with their happiness. Look, I wouldn't call myself a libertarian, and quite honestly, I wouldn't like anyone else to call me a libertarian either, but I do just think that a society in which workers are free to design and execute their own labour market strategies is preferable to one in which the power over their lives and their livelihoods is concentrated in the hands of an increasingly smaller group of powerful people, one in which millions of workers are consistently exploited, and one in which people exist in the service of capital and their needs come secondary to profit margins. Yeah, go. I'll take Jack.
All right.
Oh.
Who is it, Jack or me?
Jack.
Okay.
So you say that it's more important to give people the choice over how this is spent, but individual choices are not actually what matters when UBI is given to families. There is, for instance, pressure that a husband might put on his wife because we know that gender relations are not always equal throughout the world on how to spend their money. Why do you think people are going to
the central tenet of UBI is that it's paid to individuals. It isn't a household payment. And I'll get to this point about gender relations sooner. Don't worry, I'm getting back to that. But in general, universal basic income offers workers a safety net in order to take risks, to invest in themselves, and to negotiate better working conditions. All of these things have spillover effects into the wider economy and society. Better conditions will lead to higher productivity and fewer work-related injuries. Increased investment in skills will lead to entrepreneurship and higher, better quality output. And crucially, it offers the economy a chance to adapt and advance to increase automation. Experimental evidence from Manitoba and Canada illustrated that the introduction of UBI led to an 8.5% reduction in hospital visits, fewer work-related injuries, and fewer emergency room visits from accidents and injuries. Additionally, the security provided by UBI can lead to improvements in mental health and interpersonal relationships. And aside from all of the obvious intrinsic benefits of these things can work to negate concerns regarding the costs of UBI, the concerns that the opposition brought up, and because much of it can be mitigated by the return on investment that we see in forms of increased productivity, increased entrepreneurship, and reductions in costs on things like healthcare and legal suits. And it's not just workers in the traditional labour market who can benefit from the autonomy that UBI can provide, because it's not just a section of the population who are trapped. The financial security afforded by UBI can provide a way out for the woman trapped in an abusive relationship but who can't leave at the minute because her husband controls all of the household income. UBI can enable the family carer to go on their first holiday in years because now they can afford to pay for respite care. UBI can help the young adult escape a harmful family situation because now finally he can afford to pay for his food by himself and afford to live independently. And none of this is to say that UBI is a silver bullet. UBI won't completely solve problems of inequality in society. There will still be a need for strong state action in terms of the provision of services such as healthcare and education, in the regulation of powerful actors, and the redistribution of wealth and resources. I told you I wasn't a libertarian. But UBI provides a base from which to work, a complement to existing and improved programs aimed at targeting inequality and creating a society that enables people not just to survive, but to live fully. The implementation of universal basic income can help us to create an economy that works for the people, and the time to create this economy has come. For maybe the first time, we've seen the capacity of states to provide financial security through universal payments, and we've also seen the benefits of this provision. For the first time, people right across the political spectrum are recognizing the role of the state in ensuring that people can live with dignity and fulfillment. For the first time, we have reached a point where the implementation of universal basic income is no longer a pipe dream or a far-fetched fantasy. It is an attainable goal that we can and must achieve. I'm so proud to propose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen. I was expecting a little announcement to come in at this point.
Sorry, I couldn't find my mute button, or unmute button, apologies. But yes, I'd like just to make a quick announcement that if you're interested in giving a floor speech, that is, I think, a 4-minute speech after the competitive side of the debate has ended and the judges are adjudicating, feel free to message Maggie Larson, our CORSEC, with what position or what side you'd like to speak on. Again, just feel free if you want to speak on this motion, feel free to send a message to Maggie Larson.
Thank you very much, Brid. And I now call upon the second speaker of the opposition, Jack Kelly.
Is everyone ready? Thank you so much to the TCD Historical Society for having us. I just wanted to start off by saying my great-grandparents immigrated from Ireland, and even though I wish we could return the favor by joining you in person, as we normally do, the opportunity to also be able to see everyone over Zoom, I think, is fantastic. But I do want to take into account what has been said in this round very seriously, which is that the reason that we're doing this over Zoom is part of the reason I think we're having a discussion, that we are in particularly difficult times, and that even though the pandemic might not be the only way that we're looking at this, it is an important thing for considering why the value of a UBI might be higher or not. But unfortunately, I actually think it's an important reason for showing why the value of individual choice isn't always as high as they say it is. Because if we gave all the money to individuals to spend as they like during the pandemic, instead of spending that money, say, on the development of the vaccines that are currently being rolled out, I don't think that most people would give that money to Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson and actually create a product that ends this pandemic. I think people might do things that aren't like the stereotype they talk about of throwing the money away. We're not saying that people don't put money in a way that's useful. We're just saying that it doesn't do the things that are most useful because there are things that are public goods that people will rationally undercommit to because there is a positive externality that is not borne onto themselves. These are things like education. These are things like healthcare. There is no coincidence that these are the things that traditional welfare programs fund. It is not just because these are nice things to have. It is because it is in particular the types of things that left to their own devices you will not have enough societal spending on because the individual benefit is outweighed by the social benefit to other people. And therefore, that is why we have governments as a whole, to delegate certain powers that lead to the provision of public goods that would not be produced at a rational level by individual choice on its own. If the value of choice is so high as they claim, then even though they might say they're not libertarians, I think we need to hear what the dividing point is out of the next speaker as to why we don't just abolish government altogether and let people live on their own, which, by the way, would be justification against the kinds of progressive taxation they're arguing to fund it in the first place. But I want to structure this in two questions. Firstly, I want to give them the case that I think they pushed for at the beginning of the second speech, which is that there's no trade-off with traditional welfare. We're just providing another tool in the toolbox to fight the wealth inequality that is endemic to modern societies. I think that the problem with this argument is that you're just looking at the numbers of what they would have to justify. If we're talking about still having in place the traditional welfare programs that exist, things like having huge amounts of public health care given to lower income populations, subsidies for education, things that we tell you are very important, and also giving a UBI that is enough money to raise everyone below the poverty level to that level, I think that that would be a huge amount of redistributive taxation beyond what already exists. In principle, I think we might think this is something that is normatively justified. but I don't think it's likely to work for them in practice, because it's a bit ironic for them to say, we don't want Ireland to be attracting all these tech firms and resisting the EU's attempt for a digital taxation program just because they want to attract business, when that is the very reason that Ireland keeps those taxes low, is that they want to attract business. That is to say, maybe they think that we could get tons of money by taxing something like the land assets of very rich billionaires who, even though small in number, are large in wealth, but those billionaires aren't happy to see that money go. This is the reason we have terrible things happening from companies like Amazon, is because they chase the cheapest product they're willing to outsource, which means that if you were to raise massive taxes in order to do this alongside traditional welfare, I think you're likely to just have massive flight from the wealthiest people within that country to produce elsewhere, to move to Ireland or whatever country isn't going to have the same program. And insofar as we think that they have maybe the fiat to implement this in one government, but not worldwide, I think that this actually makes it far worse, because instead of having a few billionaires in every country that you can tax the hell out of and redistribute to the least well off, all of them are going to go to some tax haven that just says, we're not the place that's going to have a UBI. This becomes the place where they all move and operate their facilities out of, or at least file their taxes in, and you have no potential for redistribution. So even though we think that billionaires aren't ethical people, we think it's an inconvenient truth that at some level you have to keep them in your country to be able to tax them at all. And if you were to do this alongside traditional welfare, then that would be completely impossible. But the other problem with doing this with traditional welfare is that it would be massively inflationary. And I think the response we hear to the inflation point is that actually the reason that we have inflation is things like Wall Street printing out huge amounts of money. I don't actually think this is truly the use case, because the velocity of that money is actually very, very low, and central banks can manage the money supply within institutions like Wall Street. But on either case, it's not really unique to either side of the house. They just say this is an unrealistic characterization of how inflation works. It's not the case that everyone's going to spend it on candy or whatever the stereotyped image of opposition to UBI is. But we were not going for that argument. We were making a more nuanced claim. That is to say, if you were to impose this alongside a traditional welfare structure, the huge amounts of dollars circulating in the economy, or of local currency circulating in the economy, would have an inflationary cost. And importantly, and I think it's important to add this can just be a case of self-fulfilling expectations. It doesn't even need to be a case of the pure economics in itself. Why is this the case? Because inflation is a change in the price level, but the people who set the prices do so based on an expectation of what government policy dictates, which means if you do something that they admit there is a social vision of this as being handing out cash, even if they as debaters know to disagree with this, that means that many people think it will be inflationary, even if in the abstract it wouldn't be. But what does this mean? Thinking inflation is going to happen, you raise your prices so that your new price under expected inflation equals your old price. What does this do? It raises the price level. This is inflation. This is the reason why in economies like Venezuela, where the president had been printing money to finance his own spending, when he just said, I'll stop doing it, inflation continued, because no one believed him. The expectations of inflation persisted. Even if he wasn't distorting the money supply, the price level continued to rise. And we've told you why inflation is particularly hard on the least vulnerable, because it makes it very hard to do things like secure investment, because people aren't willing to give out loans if they think that they're going to lose those loans to the inflationary forces in the market. But I want to deal now with what I think is the more realistic scenario, which is that there is a legitimate trade-off with welfare. And we've told you why this is the realistic scenario, because no country probably does want to lose all of its billionaires. And I think that they give you 4 reasons to think why it might be important to keep traditional traditional welfare is failing. The first is sort of an evidentiary claim. They say the WTO doesn't support this. I don't know why this makes the claim true. In fact, 2 chief economists of the WTO have resigned because of the WTO specifically stifling research that certain countries didn't want to see. But I also think that they can cherry pick as many examples as they want. But at the end of the day, the Institute for Global Markets polled the top economists, and the vast majority of them were against UBI. At first, I thought this was only the American poll, but I actually checked the European poll, and they felt the same way too. So I don't have to say that I'm biased against the Europeans. I actually think that there's some consensus here. Secondly, they claim, well, it's hard to access traditional bureaucracy, traditional welfare. Some people are going to slip through the cracks. But we ask how, because if they're just saying, oh, even if you say you're going to give it to the poorest 20%, it's not clear how you access this. This is no less more charitable construal of our arguments than if we had accused everyone of spending this money on candy at the corner store. We say that given that they're trying to design literally a sovereign wealth fund that would raise everyone to above the poverty level, we can reasonably have welfare systems that, while not UBIs, work decently well to target people in need and give them those resources. But I actually think this is easier on our side of the house, because on their side of the house, you need a massive bureaucracy to be able to give UBI to everyone because it's, well, universal. But on our side of the house, you only have to target it to the people who are more in need. So it's less likely you have money slipping through the cracks and people slipping through the cracks, because you don't need to do the massive work to make this happen. Thirdly, they say there are bigger risks, like being trapped long run and dead end jobs. Before I get to this, I'll take the point of information.
So the reality is that the World Bank, the WTO, Finland, Sweden, India, et cetera, have all shown that this is spelled well and is changing like people's lifestyles. But in no case does it cause inflation. And even if it does, you have things like central banks, and inflation isn't an inherently bad boogeyman. It's unlikely that everywhere turns into Zimbabwe. Like, this is incredibly unrealistic.
First of all, I think there's probably like a middle point of bad inflation that isn't Zimbabwe. Like, it was 10% in the US in the 1970s, and that was really bad for the economy too. Central banks can modify it, but do you know how they fight inflation? By raising interest rates so that the unemployment rate goes up. This is the very bad thing you guys say you want to avoid. And lastly, those studies might be good. The panelists, I'm sure, could all read them on their own time, but I think they're here to have a debate where people actually look at the arguments based on the justifications for them, not deferring to experts. They say that people are trapped in these jobs. We say that it's bad to do this because eventually this UBI won't be enough to sustain you without a job, because even if you don't think there's going to be more inflation, there will be some inflation. So the UBI now will mean nothing in 10 years, but people will have skill decay because they left their old jobs and now they have none to return to. But I also think things like Instagram create new jobs. Like maybe they have fewer people in their offices, but technology is still a gigantic industry that employs tons of people. Lastly, there's an element of choice because it goes directly to your account. This isn't the argument. Even if the husband and the wife get it separately, there are social pressures. Because there is an illusion of choice, the husband pressures the wife to spend it a certain way because the patriarchy tells him he has that power. There's a pressure to give it to your parents in countries where filial piety laws are the norm. Just because you have the illusion of choice doesn't mean you have it. We say it's better to give people what they would reasonably expect under a traditional welfare system. Those are things like basic housing, education, food, etc.
Thank you very much, Jack. I think I should allow a little pause for applause. I realise I didn't do that to the earlier speakers, so apologies for that. I'm now going to call the third speaker for the proposition, Sean Gordon-Dalton.
One second there. Right, okay, my speech is going to focus on the benefits of UBI, both to the economy and to the society, and I'm also going to dispel some of the myths that we've heard crop up around UBI. But first, a little bit of rebuttal. For some reason, opposition seem to say that, okay, we can't have UBI because people don't know how to spend the money. The government is better at spending the money. And this is the argument they use against having the government interfere in the economy. Right, okay, for some reason, I don't understand the case you're trying to make. Also, the motion is this House would implement UBI, not this House believes UBI would work politically in a political sphere. We don't really have to debate the issue of whether or not wealthy lobbyists are going to like this. I'll bring very little actual relevant material to this debate, and they seem to be discussing how we go about establishing the political capital necessary to implement it, as opposed to actually the benefits that this might accrue for society. Political capital is not an issue in this debate, thus the bedrock of their argument seems to fall out completely. UBI is a very efficient way of spreading the wealth in society, while also keeping the free market intact, and this is where we get to our first myth. Poor people wasting money on things like candy, alcohol, cigarettes. Apart from the fact that it's incredibly classist, this argument is completely untrue. The reverse has actually been shown, where people who have a lot of wealth are the most likely to waste it on those kinds of vices. And that's because people who are struggling financially, the people who the UBI is going to help the most, barely have enough to make their existing ends meet. The cost of survival. Aside from paying for basics like food, rent, clothing, and mortgages, any excess income they have goes straight back into the economy. For every euro that goes to those local corner candy shops, for every year that goes to swimming pools and dance teachers and holidays, that money goes back into people's pockets and back into the government via tax revenue, creating a circular economy. Another big myth is that it leads to this massive drop in the workforce. In fact, studies have actually shown that as little as 1% of people in UBI schemes leave work, and most of those are either parents returning home to raise children or people going back to education. Both those things are not only key functions of a well-managed economy, providing a well-educated and sufficiently replenished workforce, they also contribute to a better society without some of the stresses and anxiety of mounting bills, being buried in debt and struggling to make your ends meet, with more opportunities to improve your life, your family's life, and to improve your employability. This leads to people under UBI actually becoming happier. They suffer less mental health problems, register lower rates of suicide. Liquid capital cannot be the only metric by which we measure returns on investment, and a healthier, happier, more motivated society is a return more than worth this investment. An affordable mechanism like this that directly improves the physical and mental health of people should be known enough to win this debate. But I'll continue anyway. If your argument on opposition is that we can't have UBI because the entire economy, the entire system of capitalism will collapse because now the most disadvantaged people in our society can no longer be effectively press-ganged into low-wage, demeaning work with the threats of poverty, homelessness, and destitution. Your argument not only deserves to be tried at The Hague, it's also completely wrong. People will be able to survive and remain above the poverty line with a universal basic income. But do you really believe that their ambitions stop there? Do you really believe the great majority of society is made up of people who want to fulfill their most basic needs and do no more? Because newsflash, this is the 21st century, not a Buddhist monastery. The people we are talking about are not a faceless mass. They are individuals like us. They have ambitions, they have dreams, and they have hopes. They want to work a well-paid job. They want to enjoy life. They want to go on holidays and take their partners out to dinner, to go for drinks with their friends and their children to the cinema. They want to live a good life just as much as you or I. And a universal basic income allows for that to happen. It allows people of any age, young or old, who didn't have the opportunity to go to university because of the short-term trade-off of having a degree or an income that they desperately needed, they can now attend college. The same for those who have already been to college before. People can relearn, reskill, upskill, become leaders of new or growing industries. It gives everyone a chance to not only take what they need, but to give back tenfold. And that brings me on to the next myth. We don't need a UBI. We have the welfare state. We can create similar mechanisms. As has been well explained already in this debate, the existing social welfare schemes we now have are no longer fit for purpose. The welfare state has failed, period. Putting struggling people through a convoluted and humiliating series of hoops to prove that they are somehow deserving of help. Like the idea as well that somehow the whole system is going to be better and simpler if we stay with it as is, as opposed to going to UBI, doesn't make sense because, oh, universal means everybody, therefore more people, more bureaucracy. That doesn't make sense. One standardized payment versus a whole myriad of different kinds of payments. You're talking about blind pensions, carers allowance, one parent benefit, job seekers, deserted wives, disability, farm assistance. If all of that was at least partially considered under UBI, you'd massively cut the costs and the waste in bureaucracy. And the issue with this welfare, the existing welfare state, is that it comes with so many strings attached that it actively disincentivizes people from trying to earn more. If your income is capped, as Kevin said, and if you go so much as a year over it, you lose your welfare payments and you lose the financial supports that were keeping you afloat. This can trap people from disadvantaged backgrounds in poverty, because a job that pays a minimum wage or just a little bit more than that welfare will actually leave you with less money after tax and the new bills that you've incurred. UBI allows you to return to education, start a new business, start a family, or find higher paying employment, because the most important thing in this debate is the fact that UBI provides a floor from which you can fall no lower, rather than a ceiling that you cannot reach. Because there's more to life. Also, there's more to life than work, or at least what society and the opposition might consider to be work. And this brings me to the next myth. Parenthood is work. Child rearing is a full-time job, and I know your mammy made sure to tell you so. And yet they are consistently forgotten about. They're treated as though they're living the lives of luxury on a beach with a cocktail and a little umbrella. Any parents watching this will know it's no walk in the park. It's no doubt something you've enjoyed, at least I'd hope. But it's also something you do morning, noon, and night with no reward. And while your child's smile might mean the world to you, it doesn't pay the bills. Humanity's most necessary work is completely unpaid. Couples are putting off having children. Young people are giving into the idea that now even families are a luxury to have, as opposed to a natural part of life, something you can only do if and when you make enough money to sustain it. If the opposition are so worried about inflation and the economy, you'd think they'd be worried about the shrinking populations and the shrinking workforces around the industrialized world, because people are getting older every day. It's a side effect of life. But there are less and less people going into the workforce to sustain the economy and those elderly people in their dotage. Look at Japan. So if you really want to avoid all that, consider a UBI that pays stay-at-home parents for their work, which is arguably the most valuable and underfunded role in society. society. It also goes a long way towards righting the gender pay gap and will give the women, who the opposition have mentioned, who make up a disproportionate amount of full-time parents, not only the respect they deserve from society, but the financial freedom that they are entitled to and they lack. Next myth, the big one, the big foot of all myths, is how do we pay for it? The benefits of an economic growth that we have seen so far have gone directly to the wealthiest people in society. Something very simple to do this would be increasing or implementing a wealth tax. Now, side opposition has already said they don't like that. They say society considers taxation to be a dirty word. No politician will be mad enough to raise taxes. I point out the fact that the wealth tax is one of the most popular ideas with support from voters across the political divide. But if you don't like the sound of that, we can make it a little bit less political, okay? How about the taxes on financial transactions, land value and carbon for industrial polluters? This helps us efficiently close the wealth gap. If anything, a tax on things like capital is only natural, because any value that actually incurs is something that we have actively contributed to, because capital is socially produced. Every time you use or buy goods and services, the stock goes up. A tax on capital amounts to providing a dividend to everyone in society who has contributed to its growth and existence. It's like putting aside a piggy bank, a public equity trust. Now, the funding comes from capital profits and stocks and not burdensome taxation. Political crisis averted. But this money also comes in the form of existing standardized welfare programs being replaced by the more efficient UBI, like I said, allowing the funding to be redirected, eliminating costly bureaucracy that manages it and saving money. As I said, this will only apply to standardized welfare payments as opposed to more specialized ones like disability, because as we all know, people are different and their financial floors can be different. The next myth, arguably this little cousin, we'll call it the Yeti myth, is that of inflation. Inflation will not be a problem because as we've explicitly said time and again, we are not printing this money. We're not pulling it off trees. It's not being pulled out of nowhere. It can be generated and transferred from existing funds that we already have, leading to no increase in prices of the essential services across the board, essential goods across the board. We always talk about inflation during these discussions on social or government programs like UBI, but we never talk about the fact that the majority of inflation is down to banks creating loans for venture capitalists who don't generate a return on investments for society as a whole. It goes back into their pockets. The status quo benefits the opposition because it's a broken system. Even Milton Friedman, a man I never expected to share an opinion with, effectively endorsed the idea of UBI by promoting negative income taxes in the name of cutting down on bureaucracy and welfare costs. Now, we're not arguing this is a silver bullet, but it's a key tool that we can use to effect genuine positive change for society while also creating an economy that is more insulated from economic shocks. Call it insurance. Nobody builds trickle-down houses. You don't build the foundation at the top to support the bottom. Stability and strength come from the base. UBI is not like socks you buy in the bargain bin. There's no one size fits all. Universal basic income obviously does not solve all of society's ills like urban, rural wealth divides or differences in the cost of living. But there's lots of other solutions there that are outside this debate we can do, like new programs and legislation, cost rental schemes. We can also tailor the UBI on a regional level to help with such issues, catering these payments in various ways in various countries to make it work across the board. Last thing, this finally, as Ellen said, allows workers to fight for better conditions and better wages with a stronger safety net that gives them more bargaining power. In every metric, UBI shows a positive impact, a positive result for society, and the opposition have not in any sense proved otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And finally, with the energy definitely flowing this evening, I call on the third and final speaker for the opposition, Cameron Chacon.
All right, just to confirm that I'm audible. Yes, great. Okay, starting my speech time in 3, 2. I think what that speaker has given us is some relatively good rebuttal to arguments that I never heard Jack and Prostick make. What you've never heard from the opposition bench is that poor people will only spend their money on alcohol and candy. What you've never heard is that people don't want to be employed. And what you've never heard is that, oh, you know, mothers currently ought to starve and not be able to afford to have children. I don't think that that is the argument that we're making, and I don't appreciate being strawmanned and not rebutted with in this circumstance. I want to talk about what we actually did bring you in this case, what we think the view of our world is as opposed to their world, and then just really engage with everything that we've gotten from the last speaker as well as the second speaker from government side, and explain to you why I don't think that their rosy picture of living at the poverty line in a world plagued by bad political capital use and by inflation is actually going to look so great. Okay, I want to talk about a few things here. They say that, We give a lot of reasons why it might be politically unpopular, but aha, this is a debate. We don't have to explain why it's going to politically happen. We just have to explain why it would be good if it did. I think that here's the problem with this. Even if, yes, on your side of the world, we just understand that this is past, we still live with the political consequences of those actions. What have we told you that those political consequences are? The first is that I think we do have at least some exodus, if not a mass exodus, of wealthier groups out of countries that pursue aggressive taxation or that they believe are going to pursue aggressive taxation. Jack told you very clearly that, yes, billionaires are deeply unpleasant people, but also they tend to be useful to have around when we can tax them at a reasonable level, because it means that they can generate the money that we use to fill our coffers for welfare. The second consequence that I don't think that they've engaged with is that liberalization of other parts of welfare and abandoning these places where traditional welfare does work because the market fails is not going to be very effective and is going to be truly terrible for the people that we care about most in this debate, which are the people who would be living dependent on this UBI, people who are currently struggling to stay just at or are under the poverty line. Let's engage with a few things that we heard out of the last speech. We hear that people want to work and that people will spend their money well. I agree with this. I think that the issue, however, is that the issues that you faced us with, what we've been told from the first speech, are the reasons that people are struggling in the current economy, are not things that human people can face alone. What I've been told is that, automation is coming for our jobs, that we are at record low levels of unemployment, and that's going to continue to fall. Not only will I mention briefly that this clearly contests with the point that we need to incentivize having children because otherwise we're not going to have enough people in the workforce. I've just been told that the workforce can't even support our current population, so I'm not sure where they're going with that. But I will address this point. We say that yes, education systems as they currently are stagnate a little bit behind the times, and that we're not always producing high school graduates in the United States or secondary school graduates in other places that are ready to enter the economies, that are ready and prepared to work in these workforces. But the solution is not giving people money and saying, hey, you can decide to go to college, you can decide to live off this UBI, you can decide to do whatever with it. The solution is instead to invest that money in specific educational programs that will produce workers that can work and can adapt to the shifting of economies in the developed world. What do I think this looks like? Just to give you a very clear picture of this. On their side, what we heard from the third speaker loud and clear, what has been the undertone of the entire case, is that traditional welfare is a terrible, patriarchal or patronizing bureaucracy that will never work. So we should just give people the money and let them function in the market. That's fine. Let's look at what this looks like. So I've been told that there is a woman named Janet who is not part of a union because she lives in a right to work state. I relate deeply to this person. I live in Texas. The issue is that she can't go to college because she can't quit her job. The situation on your side of the house is that she would then have $12,000 a year, or something along those lines, to both survive, pay her college debts, navigate alone the system of what degree she needs to get to be employable, probably get multiple degrees, because let's recognize that in many places, getting a bachelor's degree is not enough to guarantee gainful employment, and more. What do we give you? We say that on your side of the house, the people who she is most vulnerable to are places like predatory diploma markets, right? Which are these for-profit colleges that exist prolifically throughout the United States and other places that take advantage of the fact that the United States has stepped away from education and has said, hey, we'll give you guys Pell Grants, right? We'll give you free money to pay tuition, but we won't regulate what those tuition systems look like. We're going to defund our public colleges and public universities.
You know why?
No. I see the chat and your hands. I'll get to you later. Okay. As I said, I think on their side of the house, you lead to these gaps where you've allowed people to just liberalize and act on their own. They want to say that they're not libertarians, and then they also want to quote Milton Friedman in the speech, which I think is quite interesting. But I will say this. I think when you leave people to their own devices and when you abandon other forms of in-kind welfare, where you allow to step in are predatory companies who understand that there are undereducated people who now have access to capital that they've never had access to before, and who will lead those people astray because there are dissymmetries of information that are accessible to working class individuals from first generation families. What do we say would be a better system? We say there is a local community college or a local public college that can exist tuition free on our side of the house, since we're not diluting the pool of welfare across 100% of the economy, as opposed to focusing it on the bottom 30 or 20% of the economy. We say that we can give out programs that say you have free tuition, perhaps even subsidies for housing, subsidies for childcare, and things of that nature that would probably cost less than $12,000 a year, because we wouldn't have to be absorbing all of that cost. What else do we tell you? We tell you that similarly to how predatory tuition companies can step in, we can also have things like predatory landlords. When your landlord understands that you're now getting $12,000 a year in UBI, they know that and they have no problem raising the rent accordingly. What currently holds rents down is the threat of empty apartments, because when people can't afford rent, they will move out. We don't think that this exists on their side of the house. So even if they buy that, oh, nationwide inflation isn't going to happen, not to mention that they didn't address Jack's warrant, which is that when people think the purchasing power of the populace has gone up, they raise their prices. It has literally nothing to do with whether the central bank can check down on this, because the warrant is perception. We say that on a local level, the perception of your tenants' buying power is massively important. You can raise their rents, which means not only will these immediate costs, the raising of rents, the raising of food prices in local areas, the raising of any kind of perception of consumer spending immediately absorb large chunks of the UBI, but it also means that their absolutely crackpot dreams about what you can do on UBI become blatantly impossible. You cannot afford tuition on top of all of those things. Oh, I'm just saying 12,000 because it's near the poverty line in the US South. It can be 16,000 if you want, that's fine. I still think these arguments are completely legitimate. Okay, not to mention the fact that some of the examples you gave, such as the Alaska Residence Fund, which I happen to know because I grew up outside of Anchorage, are 1,600 USD a year, so like horrifically low and horrifically impossible to live off of. So I'll continue with the speech. Okay. What do we think happens? We think that you cannot afford to start a business. You cannot afford to pay childcare and healthcare for your child when things like national health services are defunded in order to pay for these other kinds of things. We think that they give you a viewpoint in which people don't have other kinds of costs that are set by individual actors that can raise those costs in their world. Finally, what do we tell you is the value of traditional welfare on our side of the house that only we can access? We say that on either side of the house, there's going to be some kind of pool of money for welfare. This doesn't matter necessarily what exactly this pool is. We think it's going to be largely similar. They say, we're going to pay for this by closing loopholes in Panama. If that's possible, then it's still possible on our side of the house. If that's not possible, then it's symmetrical. We think that this is largely the same, irregardless of the fact that probably rich people are more comfortable with higher taxation if it's not also UBI, also all these other things. So we probably have access to a bit more capital on our side, but even if you believe that they're symmetrical. If you believe that they are symmetrical, on our side of the house, what we can do is we can concentrate those services on people who truly need them, and we don't dilute them across 100% of society. They say, it just gets taken back in taxes anyways, but that's not the problem. The problem is that when you're sending out checks, even if that check comes right back in, you're not going to be able to afford other parts of healthcare. We tell you that there are these systemic issues. There are systemic issues over, for example, childcare in many places costing just as much as a minimum wage job pays, so you just have to stay at home. These are not solved for by giving people money. They're solved for by regulating those parts of the economy. I'll take a POI from Ellen.
Yeah, there's been a fundamental mischaracterization of our entire case. At no point did we say that there'd be no more role for government. And I think if you're talking about straw manning arguments, I think you need to recognise that if we explicitly stated that there is a need for government to regulate to continue their provision of services.
Maybe I had an issue with my audio, but what I heard explicitly from Sean's speech is that current welfare is bogged down in bureaucracy, is completely ineffective, and that we love Milton Friedman. Okay, so, but even if you, all right, hand down, it's over time. Even if you don't believe that there's 100% trade-off, we think that there are many meaningful trade-offs, not just in the minds of voters, not just in the fact that only a certain amount of bills can be passed, but literally in the fact that these things cost money and we're going to have to limit them at some point. What do we tell you the purpose of traditional welfare is? We say the purpose of traditional welfare is that there are people within the government whose whole job it is to solve systemic societal issues, like the fact that consumers can't differentiate the cost of healthcare, right? Because when I need an ambulance, I can't call 3 different companies and ask, hey, how much is an ambulance, right? We say that there are problems like automation, where US public systems need to adapt to a new kind of education and need to produce different kinds of workers. We say that there are problems like private school tuition, which at Yale College, if I paid it, which I don't, would be $75,000 a year, right? You can't fill these holes just by throwing money at consumers without protecting them from these predatory actors. What do we tell you? We tell you that when you actually intervene in the economy, when you give that money in concentrated, pointed amounts, you'll have not only the political capital, but the economic efficacy to save people from the real harms of poverty. For these reasons, very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Cameron. And I think because I perhaps didn't allow enough time for applause all round, I think I'm going to call from all the panelists and everyone watching, I think a round of applause for all of those wonderfully energetic, passionate speeches. Thank you, everyone. Okay, now I think this is the point where I get to hand back over. We judges go off and disappear and have a talk and miss out what I'm sure will be some great floor speeches, but I'm going to hand back over the chair now. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hi, I think that's my cue to come in. I'd like to thank all the judges and good luck with the adjudication. I wouldn't like to be in your position, but just to explain what's going to happen now. Basically, the judges are going to leave this call and adjudicate in a separate Zoom call. Take all the time you need for that, because we have some wonderful floor speeches for this evening to continue this debate. The floor speeches will be 5 minutes in length, and feel free as audience members to make POIs and to interact with them, because I'm sure they'd look forward to that. And yes, I believe the floor speeches, they're being added to the call and they're currently already in the call. Excellent. And yes, same sort of idea. 5 minutes, first minute's protected time, last minute protected time. So you have 3 minutes to make POIs. If you're interested in doing that for the chat or the Q&A function, go ahead. Once the judges have made the decision, they'll come back to this call and we'll have, I believe, a poll to see what the audience thought were the which side won, and then we'll also be awarding the best team and also best speaker. Very exciting stuff. Oh, I also believe there'll probably be at some point a bit where we'll just plug our events, because obviously we always take that opportunity whenever it's given to us. But yeah, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the first floor speech of this evening, and I believe it's Martha McKinney-Perry, who will be speaking on the proposition side.
Cool, just getting started in 3, 2, 1. You wake up every day and you're filled with fear. Today could be the day that you lose your job. Today could be the day that someone finds a way to make your job faster, easier, cleaner, cheaper, better, less room for error, less breaks, less mistakes, less human. Today could be the beginning of the end. Automation doesn't just mean robot arms in factories. It means new programs to send automated emails. It means algorithms for collecting data. It means a lot of menial tasks that are taken up by individuals with real jobs in the world are taken off the table. Mass unemployment is a serious and proximate threat. COVID pushed hundreds of thousands out of the job market. Automation will devastate millions. 20 million factory and manufacturing jobs gone by 2030. The problem is that the jobs that get Thanos snapped out of existence don't get replaced. No company is going to hire 20,000 new workers out of pocket because there's an unemployment crisis going on. No one on opposition bench explained to us what happens if the only difference between being homeless and not, between putting food on the table and not being able to, is taken away, and you have no floor on which to save yourself if that happens. 4 things from the opposition bench that I don't think really stand. Firstly, on paternalism, the first opposition speaker stood up and said, people don't know what's best for them and will spend this wrong. Couple of responses. Firstly, I think if you are so broke that losing the job that you have to automation or to anything means that you can't pay your rent, I think you spend this on rent. I think if your child needs new shoes, no, thank you. I think if your child needs new shoes for school, if you cannot afford healthcare, if you're living on £7 a week of groceries like Jack Monroe, I think you spend it where you need it. Secondly, the government doesn't have epistemic access to needs of citizens. So maybe the 30-year-old working full-time in Tesco who cannot advance to a higher wage bracket without losing welfare knows that they need TV or they need some kind of hobby that might be somewhat expensive or that they can't afford anyway to keep them sane. And no one on op bench ever explains why that is a bad thing. Secondly, on false trade-offs, they say public goods like vaccines are gone. No one explains to me why the political capital acquired by this and the brilliant optics of the government funding a massively important public good suddenly disappears, because assuming that we are still living in a democracy, governments still want to be elected. It's unclear why the governments go, look, we're hands off now, we're not going to fund fucking vaccines in the middle of a global pandemic. It's unclear why this kind of false trade-off is ever standing in debate like this, because I don't think suddenly implementing universal basic income means any government is going to stand up and no longer take take moves that they think are beneficial for their own optics. Thirdly, on inflation, I think it is very reasonable to say that UBI would probably not be one fixed price forever. I don't think we just agree that it's 12,000 for the rest of time if we're saying that that's the case. I think it is often going to react to a changing poverty line. I think because of this, saying UBI no longer has spending power is probably out of the debate. But I think landlords raising rent is probably also unlikely, given that regulations and renters unions exist to hold landlords to account. I don't think landlords become gods suddenly who are no longer held to account in any way. And finally, on pressure from external people, I just think if husbands in a society can make wives spend money in a certain way, if parents can force adult children to spend it in another way, I think this is so massively symmetric that no one ever explains to me why this is crucially explicitly related to universal basic income at the point where a husband can make his wife spend her wage in any way in the first place. How does this actually play out in the lives of real people who have job loss as an existential threat to them in the status quo? In the status quo, low-skill workers, factory workers, or those on the office floor who know their jobs are precarious, watch as new machinery and new tech comes in and everyone across the floor gets fired. Often, low-skill workers who are working class live near each other, so they go home at the end of the day and watch their neighbours and ex-co-workers struggle to find work again, get evicted if they can no longer afford rent, watch their kids go to school with hunger in their eyes, watch their ex-co-workers deny medical treatment when they're sick or they're injured because they just can't afford that medical bill. I think there is a constant fear that comes from this of losing your own job to automation because you see firsthand, you're out of time, sorry, what happens and you can never hedge against it. You know it is inevitable. You know the chance to, you know that you are unable to hedge against the harm of automation taking the job that you have. And you know that there's a massive barrier to entry for reskilling in the first place because it's expensive and also oversaturated. And there's an existing unemployment crisis. It's only getting worse. It's unclear if you lose this job, if you'll be able to get another one. I think what changes on the proposition side is that UBI provides a safety net. I think even in the worst case, if the inevitable happens and automation takes your job, or you lose it because the company goes bankrupt, or you lose it to anything, I think you know that you won't be made homeless. I think you know that you will still be able to feed your kids, and you know that treatment for a broken arm isn't going to financially decimate you. The impact is twofold. The first is that low-skill workers, who I think are the most affected by this and how it plays out, always have access to necessities under UBI because it's obvious you spend your money on necessities. You're not going to buy a TV if you need to pay your rent. But job loss is no longer an existential threat to life as they know it. But secondly, the psychological burden of knowing that job loss would destroy you is no longer present, meaning you are no longer in this constant state of fear and worry, which perpetuates on the opposition side. Beg you to propose.
Thank you, Martha, for what was a great speech. Now I'd like to call upon Daniela Williams to oppose the motion.
Hi. If you're going to give me a POI, please put it in the chat because I get jumpy when people interrupt me. Cool. Right. Good evening, everyone. I promise I'm actually a student at Trinity. I just decided to betray everyone for the Yanks because America. Okay, so I think that at the end of this debate, we can all agree that we're in a period of economic recession. I think we can all agree that there's greater economic recession looming ahead and threatening all of us. And I think we can all agree that at the end of the day, we need some kind of solution before we all go under and all lose our jobs to fun little robots. Look, the proposition forwards a variety of problems that the universal basic income can solve. They tell us that there's economic inequality in the status quo. They tell us that welfare programs are often not fit for purpose and often let people slip through the cracks and mean that people cannot access the money and the supports that they need. And they tell us that the rise of automation looms and it poses a threat to all of our jobs. I agree that all of these problems are pressing, but at the end of the day, I think that there's alternate solutions. And I think there's better solutions than the ones that have been presented today. I think that if there's a political will to implement and keep UBI in place, I think we ought to use it otherwise. Because contrary to Sean, I think who tells you that political will doesn't matter because like the UBI needs to be feasible in order to have this debate. I think that sure this is partially true because like we do like yeah, but I think that ultimately like a universal basic income needs to be long term in order to gain a lot of the benefits that we get from proposition. Note that like governments are hopefully elected in and out periodically. I think programs largely just need to be popular if they're ever I think programs need to be popular if they're ever going to survive. Consequently, I think that we need to ensure that whatever program we put in place consequently, I think that we need to ensure that whatever program we put in place to tackle all these problems and solve all of them needs to be popular. It needs to have buy-in from not only large swaths of the population, but also people with a significant amount of economic capital, who probably have more influence over policy than most of us on the ground. And I think this is important because political will, especially in the case of something like spending money, money is finite. And I think that money as well is also finite. Okay, what do I think the solutions probably are instead? I think the first and probably most obvious solution that is preferable is something like welfare reform. Yeah, sure. I think welfare systems in the status quo have plenty of problems. I think it's preferable to fix holes in welfare programs, to lift restrictions on how people can spend things like food stamps, and address all the problems that Sean talks about in his speech. I think this is preferable because it's means tested. Why do I think this is better than the universal basic income? First of all, I think it probably just saves money because it ensures it goes to people who genuinely need it. I think that it's a little bit more gray than the poorest of the poor whose jobs are all going to get replaced by robots, and billionaires, of which there are a few, right? I think there's plenty of people in the middle bracket who probably just don't need this money. I think this means you probably just don't have to raise this money through things like taxes, and I think that you just maintain that political capital. But furthermore, I think you probably just maintain buy-in from both sides of the political spectrum, right? Because I think that you probably get buy-in from the left who agree with you. I think you get buy-in from the left who agree that you've reformed welfare and are helping people who are vulnerable. But also you probably get buy-in from the right who don't look at this as wasteful spending, and who don't look at this as wasteful spending, and who don't look at this as something that's harming the amount, that's driving up the amount of taxes that they have to pay. So you probably avoid that dog whistle as well. I think also just a well-oiled welfare reform system can become a focal point of national pride. Look at the National Health Service in the UK. I think lots of people within the UK are largely proud of that and are very protective of it. I think that when you set up a welfare system that is reformed to the point where it is functional, to the point where it addresses all of the holes we've heard about on proposition, I think that we get a lot of it. I think that it's probably popular enough to endure into the long term, and to ensure it doesn't get repealed at some point in time. Look, I think that there's plenty of problems, and I think there's plenty of problems with economic inequality, and I think that we're facing new ones that we're unsure how we're going to be able to tackle long into the future. I think you solve those problems and co-opt a lot of the benefits that we get from proposition if we just reform a welfare system and utilize the political capital that would probably go towards obtaining a universal basic income, and funneling that into reforming the welfare system, filling up holes, and ultimately getting all of the benefits that we see from side proposition. For all those reasons, so proud to propose.
Oh, wait, my job. Yes. Thank you, Danielle, for what was a great speech. I'd now like to call upon Seamus O'Neill to propose the motion.
Hi. So I'm going to argue a slightly different angle. So we've heard a lot of excellent speeches here today, and I just want to I'm going to step back and do the big picture, because I think everybody's done a fantastic job of illustrating the effects on the individual. And that's obviously, individuals are the most important stakeholders in this debate. But I do want to illustrate sort of the big picture here. And this is a big claim, but I think the UBI helps prevent neocolonialism by developed countries. So let me just get right into it. So as Sean mentioned in his excellent speech, the modern economy is killing the birth rate in developed countries. Now, we can argue the merits or demerits of having a growing population on an already crowded planet. And some would argue that there are already too many people in the West, sort of living beyond their means, more than the planet can really take care of. And that's a big problem, but that's not what I'm going to argue. That's a separate debate. So as Sean said, look at Japan or Germany or Italy or Russia or even China, right? What do all of these countries have in common? They are major world economies today, which have populations that are already declining or are set to decline within the next couple of years or decades. Now, why is that the case? Well, birth rates are really low. And why is that the case? Well, there's two main reasons. One of the reasons is actually a really good thing. So we don't want to mess with that. And that reason is women's liberation. So most women in the developed world, and I'm including basically Europe, the United States, Canada, and Japan in that category, are not, in addition to doing all of the unpaid housework that they've always had to do, they are also working, as professionals. And because of those two things, oftentimes it just too busy to have, multiple children, having children later and later. And these are statistics that you can look up in like any country. This is kind of like, well known in I'm sure all the geographers in the audience are like, nodding their heads. Yeah. So the other reason is that children are really expensive, especially in an era like ours with stagnant wages and where college degrees are a necessity for even like modest financial success, right? So these two things mean that birth rates are really low in most of the developed world. And as time goes by and populations age in all of these countries, the workforce shrinks. And why is this bad? Well, because it means that fewer workers are paying in to the social welfare system, which has to support an even larger number of old people. And given that there are fewer young people out there buying things, that means that there's just less stuff going on in the economy, which means the market is also shrinking, which is bad, right? We don't want a shrinking economy. Look at Japan. The average age is close to 50 and still rising, and the economy hasn't grown in over 20 years. Japan's economy stopped growing in the 1990s for a whole bunch of reasons, but the reason it hasn't started growing since then is because it's getting older and older and older, right? And in the capitalist world system, a shrinking economy means declining relevance to global politics and a collapsing welfare system, right? That's bad. Corporations in developed countries and in China too, which has the same issue, need new markets to sell their goods now that their own markets are shrinking, since there are fewer and fewer consumers in these countries with declining populations or soon to be declining populations. Also, you can just yell when I'm done because I don't have a timer. Anyway, so countries that see their economies in danger, given these declining consumer markets, will do whatever they can to stave off economic and political decline. Remember, their welfare systems supporting their huge elderly populations will collapse if they aren't taxing corporations, since again, their populations are declining, so they can't rely on a young worker tax base. So if the corporations in these countries aren't making money due to these shrinking markets, the whole economy sort of goes down the tube. It could be slowly, it could be quickly, but either way, it's not a good thing. So what do these countries do? Well, they have to find new markets. Where are these markets? Where the population is growing and where there's no industry already there to sort of compete with these developed manufacturing countries. So where's that? Well, the developed world, or the developing world. So, most of Africa, several countries in Latin America, and a lot of the southern portion of Asia, right? And, think about it. Why does France, a former colonial power, keep so much, why does it care so much about keeping influence in West Africa? There's several reasons for this. One of them is related to terrorism. But a big one is because it wants to keep selling French goods into these countries. Why is China building naval bases in the Indian Ocean in East Africa, right? It's not to antagonize the United States. The reason that they're doing this, one of the reasons that they're doing this, besides trying to contain India, which is one of their rivals, is to make sure that they have access to these East African markets so that they can sell their goods into them when their own consumer markets start shrinking, right? Why did Russia take over Crimea? Well, that's a complicated one, but again, there is a connection to markets and declining population. Russia wants to keep access to the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and world markets so they can keep selling, arms and grain to the Middle East. And if they don't have access to those markets, since their own market is already shrinking, Russia already has a shrinking population, then their own welfare system it's already very strained given US sanctions. That might push it over the edge. And the last thing that, a country like Russia wants, governed by a person like Putin, is social instability, because that could lead to some major, major issues like, Soviet Union breakup style issues. And let me get back to the point. So how will the UBI solve this, right? It will help raise birth rates in developed countries. Now, it won't fix this problem entirely, but it'll give people the option to have children if they want them. If people feel that having children won't be an insurmountable burden, they're more likely to have kids. And again, this doesn't mean that the birth rate will shoot back up to five kids for couple, back like it was in the 1800s. Like we that's not going to happen. But it might raise it enough to sort of stave off this declining population, shrinking market, countries need to go overseas to secure new markets kind of dynamic. So, if we institute the UBI, will neocolonialism still happen? Yeah, probably. But with the UBI in developed countries, it'll no longer be a necessity for these developed countries to go overseas and to grab these new markets, because at least they'll have a stable home market. You know, it won't be part of their necessary national interest. So this is like a very long time scale thing. This will take like a really long time to, you know, it'll take like 30, 40 years for the effects of this to be felt. But in the long term, it'll contribute immensely to global stability, because you'll have less of a neocolonial urge among developed countries. Thank you.
We'd like to thank the speaker for his speech. And I'd now like to call upon Cynthiana. Sorry, Cynthiana, sorry, I wasn't sure how to get your attention. To oppose the motion.
Like any other, I'm also an American that has chosen.
Cynthiana, I think you're in robot mode.
She's wearing AirPods. She can't hear us.
Oh my God, she doesn't speak broke.
Is this better now? I think
Yes.
that this is better.
I thought you were being automated.
Oh, of course.
Oh,
yes.
Speak
Obviously.
Respect.
Because that is truly the dystopian novel that is our lives. Anyway, that's better now. I was just making a joke about how I'm an American and I'm on op. That's all. I didn't start yet, so we're fine. I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. So in terms of neocolonialism, I think that this is largely not necessarily linked well enough for us to say that UBI will prevent this from happening in the future, because I think that if we were to implement more resources to these developing countries, this just means that they'll continue to plug more money into this market, because they also benefit from having these trade relations with developed countries, because it is a sustainable partner that they can always rely on taking their products. Because note, it isn't just France selling its goods to like previous colonies, it's these raw materials also going back to France and other countries as well, or specialized markets being created. So I don't necessarily see the link in terms of neocolonialism. As to Martha's speech, I think in terms of the paternalism attitude, I think that this is largely the result of the fact that the government has this information asymmetry that nobody necessarily has necessarily acknowledged to the extent that it needs to be acknowledged within this debate. I think that the government has your tax returns, it has the ability to evaluate the markets precisely in the way that an individual cannot. I think it has the ability to create a sustainable plan for you in a way that is not necessarily catered in any other way previously. I think that the government is able to hedge for your financial illiteracy for having ended up in this position in the first place in a way that is largely more targeted and is not necessarily addressed in any way through UBI. Because yes, even though you think that you are doing the best thing for your money because of the way that you have been exposed to financial literacy, does not necessarily mean that that is correct. Secondly, I think that you also have confirmation bias in the extent in which you'll be like, oh, I have this money, I don't necessarily have to spend it in this particularly expected way because I know that I am always correct and all of my decisions are golden and fantastic. Clearly, this is how I'm going to get out of this hole. I think that we're largely just not necessarily considering the ramifications of how this person has ended up in this position in the first place. And in terms of inflation, I think that this like boogeyman that we've created in this debate in terms of like how inflation is going to be created, I think in terms of like Martha acknowledging that this UBI will fluctuate in terms of not necessarily being one that is constant, I think that largely hedges against the benefits that you're trying to claim and saying like, oh yes, we're having this consistent money that you're giving out to people, but if this fluctuates, how is this person supposed to rely on this consistent money, A? But B, in terms of inflation, I think that there are some, like, even if we have this trade-off of like there's some limited amount of good inflation, I think that this is something that we largely can have on our side of the house as well, in terms of creating a stable source of income. Okay, thirdly, in terms of automation, I think that, again, confirmation bias comes into play. I don't think a person wakes up every day and is like in fear of their job being taken over. I think that this is largely because A, people think that they are special and loved and desired in their workplaces and their jobs. B, they think that they have provided a specific skill that cannot be replaced. And C, they think that they're just living their lives and they have this confirmation by having a paycheck at the end of the week that they still have this job. So they think that they're still a contributing member to society and they're not having this fear. I think that this is something that's a long-term and created in terms of like automation that people just don't have a proximate connection to on an everyday life, because note the jobs that you're generally characterizing in this scenario are ones which are like low skilled wage workers, and considering that they're likely working like 3 jobs, have families, need to put money need to put food on the table and need to have money in savings to some extent, or like work out of this poverty hole. I don't think that they're really concerned about automation as much as they're concerned about when their next paycheck is coming into their bank. So I think in terms of like automation and this impact of like fear going away, I don't really see how this tracks in terms of like automation being a proximate concern. But let's say even if it is, I think that automation is something that is largely going to be considered an opportunity for people to still engage with education to some extent, because Note is more accessible today than ever before to actually rechange your career or like have a different approach to education. I think that you are likely to want to go to like an online school or whatever to get a different degree or a different opportunity. Okay, on to what has largely been missing from this debate. I think that we've talked about the vulnerable group to such a large extent, but we've largely missed out on this group that is growing every day, particularly in America, which is the middle class. I think that this is largely the result of an inability for the government to necessarily hedge in terms of how we're going to approach these income inequalities. I think that the middle class is growing to such a large extent because of our inability to create a sustainable minimum wage. I think that this is largely the issue in which UBI comes into this debate. I think that the minimum wage is not necessarily increasing anytime soon because of the fact that there is this narrative that we have a sustainable minimum wage in terms of a national minimum wage or even on a local community basis. But this is largely a fallacy in terms of people are not necessarily able to actually engage with their income to a proper extent. I think that UBI is going to hurt this movement further in terms of removing the opportunity for people to get a sustainable long-term change in economic benefits of minimum wage, because it creates this narrative that, oh, you have this money as a backdrop anyway, you don't necessarily need a minimum wage increase, although the minimum wage is the one that is actually going to account for this inflation that you'll engage with, irrespective of UBI or not. I think secondly, in terms of like the information asymmetry that we see, welfare reform is one that is largely going to be more beneficial, but I think that the minimum wage largely mitigates the need for welfare reform, because if you actually impact this idea of minimum wage, you're going to have a better change. Secondly, I think in terms of taxes, in different sources, I think that the minimum wage increase allows for better tax resources, and I think it allows for a better influx into the economy in terms of how we are going to engage profitably with people being successful. For these reasons, I don't think that the UBI should be implemented.
We'd like to thank the speaker for their fine speech, and I actually believe the judges are coming back, which is fantastic to see. So I believe now is the point where I will put the question to the House on the motion that this House would implement a universal basic income. All those in favor, please vote aye. All those against, please vote nay.
Feel free to vote, panelists and audience members. Took me about 6 months, but I did figure out how to let panelists vote in these.
I believe actually I'll just take this moment to explain that we will be having an afters this evening, or tonight, essentially, on a separate Zoom, because that is our lives now. But if you're interested in joining us on a Zoom, we'll have breakout rooms. We'll be playing a couple of different games. We'll probably have further discussions on this motion, on economics in general, I guess. Please feel free to pop along to that Zoom. We'll be having it once this webinar has ended, and I'll be shooting the link into the chat right now, if I can find the link.
Okay, so just a couple of people haven't voted. I'll give that a couple more seconds, and well, yeah, I suppose I'll go ahead and share the results.
The motion has been carried
by the audience.
By the audience, sorry, but
now for now for the judges. If we could invite our panel of judges to take the floor to give their adjudication.
Well, thank you very much, Maggie, and thank you everyone for a fine evening. And I'd like to thank my fellow panel of judges, Shreya Nanda, Laurie McFarlane and Brian O'Donovan. And I did try and suggest that since I've got a short chair, Jess, one of those others could speak now, but I didn't get any takers on that. So you get me giving the results as well from the chair. And we were asked to reflect on 4 issues, which was engagement, content, team coherence, and rebuttal. And first of all, to say that I think it was a great debate, very well done by all sides. We all enjoyed it. And there was a lot of engagement, a lot of research, a lot of passion. And, you know, my particular credit to, I know how difficult it is sometimes, you know, giving speeches, being passionate at your screen while I think we only had one barking dog, but, you know, while life goes on around you and behind you, and you don't have that, all that kind of audience interaction that you get in a physical environment. So, you know, well done to everyone. Just a couple of constructive comments in terms of engaging an audience, particularly on Zoom. There's a real temptation to try and get all of your points in. They're brilliant points. You want to rush them all in. You can make a lot more impact if you take a pause, if you perhaps speak a bit more quietly. You even make people lean in a little. And that's something that some speakers did use, but perhaps it wasn't perhaps as common as I might have expected. And thinking about not for 10 minutes of people looking at a screen and you're speaking at great speed with the same level of passion and tone the whole time. That's something that, you know, is a constructive comment. In terms of content, we did see some repetition whereby speakers seemed to say pretty well exactly the same thing their previous speakers said. And obviously, again, in a remote environment, perhaps coordination is not quite so easy, but it does kind of jar a little when that happens. And I think it's also important to make sure that things are very much on the point and you don't end up down a side alley. And I did feel that Yale, as the opposition, got rather stuck on inflation. And we got told a lot about why inflation was bad, but that wasn't really kind of the point, the main point. In terms of team coherence, well, as I've already said, generally, I thought we thought as a panel of judges that was good. Although perhaps, again, on the opposition side, the Yale side, it really only felt like with the final speaker that we really understood what the argument was being made. Whereas I would say perhaps, you know, in terms of setting out the case, in terms of the proposition, perhaps from the first speaker, we didn't really have a sense of structure of where that speaker or where things were going. So we could perhaps have done some more structure. In terms of rebuttal, generally people handled that very well. I think Ellen, the second speaker for the proposition, particularly handled the gender question very well. Perhaps the third speaker for the proposition, there was a certain amount of straw man setting up happening on both sides, but particularly there was a lot of rebuttal of arguments that hadn't actually been made in the first place. You know, it's very tempting, of course, when you sit down to think about what the opposition is going to say and to come up with a list of those things. But if they don't say them, you could perhaps structure it by saying, well, they might have said this, and I'm really glad they didn't, because it would have been a stupid argument. It just needs a little more twist in it to make it actually hang together and work. But those what are meant to be constructive comments, not criticisms at all. We as a panel of judges, to repeat, thought that was a really excellent debate, and I think people have perhaps not surprisingly, but I've still seen an awful lot of people in the House of Lords who haven't done it. Everyone's really done a good job of mastering operating under these difficult circumstances on Zoom. If you really want to see something funny, I can recommend, or possibly if you want to go to sleep, tuning into the House of Lords TV, because you'll see some people using Zoom really, really badly. Indeed, the House of Commons is equally the same. It was a very good evening, a subject very close to my own heart. As a judging panel, we were, however, unanimous, which was kind of handy given there was 4 of us, so we didn't quite know what we were going to do if we had a 2-2 split. But nonetheless, it is my job to announce the winning team, and the winning team is the proposition Trinity. And the other job that I have, I'm very pleased to say, and this was a really tough contest, and saying that everyone did a great job, but the judge's decision again was final, that the Best Speaker of the Evening award goes to Cameron from Yale. Okay, so I'm guessing I'm going to go straight on to what is rather formally titled the Chair's Address, unless anyone has anything formal to do. All right, okay. Well, I'm told I have 10 to 12 minutes, and I'll try and do it in 10 because, you know, at the end of the evening, that's a good place to go. And, you know, if you're the after dinner speaker, talk and sit down is always a good bit of advice. But I thought it might be useful we haven't really introduced, it's a pity we didn't get to introduce all the judges. I haven't really introduced myself. And I do think it's nice that we do bring in a kind of three-continent perspective, because if you've been sitting there all evening wondering, I wonder where that accent comes from. Well, it comes from Australia originally, although I'm now a member of the UK House of Lords for the Green Party. And I was pleased this evening we were having some pre-discussion that we had at least one maths graduate or maths student speaking this evening, and I think we had a few economics students, which made quite a change. I've spoken at quite a few of similar events at Oxford and Cambridge and that, and you always have a lot of classics people there. So it was nice to get some different sort of references, but I bring in the scientific perspective in that my first degree was agricultural science. So one of the things when I was first elected as leader of the Green Party of England and Wales in 2012, which I was for 4 years to 2016, one of the first things the British media got very excited about when you put that Australian origins and the agricultural science degree together was the fact that I was probably the only British political leader who knew how to shear a sheep, which probably tells you more about the British media than it did about me, really. But that's a little bit about me. I also lived in Bangkok for 5 years, and we had a bit of a sort of media coterie going on in the judging panel because I was, for most of those years, a journalist, and I finished up as editor of the Guardian Weekly, the international edition of the Guardian. Now, it's probably traditional in these speeches to actually make it one long string of after-dinner style jokes, I rather suspect. And, you know, I should apologise in advance that that's not my natural style. I can do it when really pushed to it if I really feel like it's essential. But you did invite me to come along and talk about UBI. And universal basic income is one of my pet subjects. So I'm afraid you're going to get a few reflections from me on universal basic income and what's been said this evening, because I am very passionate about it. And indeed, when I joined the Green Party in 2006, universal basic income was one of the reasons why I joined it. And that's one of the arguments that didn't come up this evening, which is that the Green Party of England and Wales and many other Green parties around the world, universal basic income has actually been our policy for 40 years. We've been, you know, I would say, the leaders in this, as on many issues. But for many years, we were ploughing a very lonely furrow, and we did very much see it as an environmental policy. And the reason why I would say that UBI is an environmental policy is at the moment, and the proposition certainly alluded to this, one of the huge problems in all of our societies is insecurity. But the converse side of that insecurity is people desperately grasping for security. And that means in many of our societies, people not trusting the pension system, whether it's a state or a private pension system, not having it available to them. People try and acquire more stuff, so that will give them security. They buy a bigger house so that then, you know, they can sell that off and downsize in their retirement, and that's security. Or indeed, you know, because the ladder of social inequality is so steep, you have to keep climbing up. And should you, you know, even stand still, there's a risk that then you get cut off as not being one of those go-ahead people. So people feel like, you know, you have to be casually leaning on the water cooler, and this is a pre-COVID type story, casually leaning on the water cooler and saying, well, you know, on my long weekend trip to Dubai on the weekend, this was what I was doing, because that proves you're a go-ahead kind of person. So the insecurity, the inequality, the fear drives an enormous amount of consumption, and that's why I'd say UBI is a green policy. I think we didn't also get a lot this evening about the issue of human rights. I think it was Sean who mentioned, sort of implicitly said, being tried at The Hague. And that's actually where I started, first of all, on universal basic income, because if we accept the right to life as a basic human right. And that's something that, even when I'm sitting in the House of Lords, looking across at the benches opposite, so that means looking at the Tories, even most of the Tory benches would accept the human right to life. There's probably one or two exceptions to that, but mostly they would. And yet we don't, as lots of speakers this evening alluded to, with 0 hours contracts, with inadequate wages, we don't guarantee people the basic right to food, to housing, the essentials of life. So I would say that UBI should be a human right. And in fact, I attended an exhibition at the British Library in 2008 on human rights that did suggest that UBI was the ultimate human right. But I think I was very interested to hear, and perhaps I'm being somewhat national stereotyping here, that the word libertarian was being thrown from across the other side of the pond as a term of abuse. But I probably speak about UBI 20 times a year or more. And some of the most fun I've had was before COVID. I was doing a whole tour of, there's a group called Skeptics in the Pub, which are, as they would sound, like people who meet in pubs to talk about things. And it was actually a Skeptics in the Pub person after we had 200 people in Coventry in the pub talking about universal basic income. And after lots and lots of people had said how great it was, and they'd agreed with me about this and agreed with me about that from the audience, one of the audience members got up, and it's possibly one of the best audience questions I've ever heard, and said, "We're supposed to be called skeptics, so why isn't anyone asking any skeptical questions?" And so he turned it around to me and said, what's the difficult question? What's the question you'd ask yourself about UBI that would give a negative answer? And I did have one of those speaker moments for a second where you go, oh God, what am I going to say? But after I got over that, it came to me the answer, which was, I actually once had the misfortune very early in my political life to share a platform with the Adam Smith Institute, where they were advocating for what they called universal basic income. Now, what they were actually advocating for was a wage subsidy. Their theory was you give everyone a little bit of money, and then the employers could all pay their workers less. And I think we sort of got to this evening, but perhaps we didn't in the debate really get to the depths of this issue as well, as much as we might have done, which is that UBI has to sit at a level which, as the proposition said several times, gives workers the rights to say, no, we're not going to take on that terrible job. And one of the other issues that didn't come up this evening that I think is often put as a challenge is, well, but what are we going to do to get people to do those really horrible jobs that no one wants to do if it's a UBI and people don't have to take those jobs? And I take as a case study for this, imagine sewerage cleaners. How are we going to get people to go and clean out the sewer pipes? That being perhaps one of the worst jobs you can imagine. Of course, because I do lots of events in the evenings talking like this, someone always puts their hand up, as someone did at a public meeting once said, well, my mate's a sewer cleaner and he loves his job, so that's a really good job. But anyway, let's imagine that sewer cleaning is a job that we might find it hard to get people to do. And I've got a simple answer to that in a UBI society, and that is that maybe you have to pay people quite a lot of money to clean the sewers. Maybe you have to pay sewer cleaners more than you pay bankers. Maybe you should pay sewer cleaners more than you pay bankers. And I think that's a rather good argument for a UBI society, really. But I'll just go on with one more argument. I'm looking at my clock and looking at the time. But I think there was a lot of discussion about the potential freedom that UBI creates, but it was actually really brought home to me about how to think about how a UBI potentially is not a panacea, as the proposition said, but an utterly transformatory policy. And I thought about this when I met a wonderful 17-year-old young Polish man who was a campaigner for UBI in Poland. And he was saying to me that it was pretty tough to campaign for UBI in Poland. He was also a climate striker, and it was pretty tough to run climate strikes in Poland as well. But campaigning for UBI, because of course, in a post-communist society, you got an immediate reaction of, oh, well, that's socialism, that's communism, that's relying on the state, and that's a bad thing. And it was actually talking to him that it really came to me that why a UBI society is really transformatory difference is in communism, the state can tell you what you have to do to get your money to survive. It directs you to go and work in a certain job. It directs you to do certain things. In capitalism, it's the boss, your employer, who gets to decide how you spend your time, how you use your talents, how you use your energy. But in a UBI society, it's actually people, and I think the proposition got to this a little bit, talking about people being able to study, develop themselves, what they like. In a UBI society, you can decide what your talents are, how to use your skills, how to use your time. So one other answer I could have given to my skeptic question was, what's a bad thing about a UBI society? Well, you'll get lots of really bad poetry written. I will accept this as a fact. Lots of people will decide that their vocation in life is to be a poet. Now, one of my answers to that is agreeing is that, bad poetry has a really low carbon footprint. You don't even have to print it. No one wants to buy it. But of course, to be serious, you also get some wonderful poetry written that wouldn't have been written otherwise. Some wonderful paintings done, some wonderful music composed. People get to choose their talents. And, I promise it didn't influence my judging tonight, but, I've laid my cards on the table now where I am with UBI. And I agree with the proposition. It's not a panacea. It's not, but it is, I would say, an essential precondition for a future kind of society, which brings me to my final 1 minute wrap up, which is a final message to all of you. And it's an answer to something the first speaker for the opposition said, which said that UBI is the opposite to the status quo. And I very much agree with that. But my message of good news, and I always like to finish on a message of hope, is that the status quo, the way our societies are now, is profoundly unstable. And that's really good news, because our societies don't just face a climate emergency, a nature crisis, huge levels of poverty and inequality, epidemics of mental ill health. We've got all these problems together. And that might look like, gosh, it's really difficult, but it's clear that things are going to change. Things are now profoundly unstable. And one of the things that's a foundational belief for me as a Green is that there's enough resources on this planet for everyone to have a decent life if we just share them out fairly. What I would say is that centrist politics is now dead, because centrism means leaving things much as they are. So you have broadly that kind of politics, or you have a far right politics, and I don't need to put any names to that, attach your own local names, a far right politics that says, oh, it's a difficult, dangerous world, we've got to grab what we can for us and ours and shove those others away, build walls to keep them out. Or as the British Home Secretary suggested, put nets in the channel to make sure the asylum seekers can't get across. That's one kind of politics. The other kind of politics is our politics of hope. That's the politics of fear. We offer the hope. And how do we deliver that? We deliver that by people getting engaged, getting involved. Politics should be what you do, not have done to you. And that's what you're all doing tonight. So thank you very much. Keep on doing it. And I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much to Natalie for that absolutely wonderful chair's address. And just before ceding the floor back to the auditor, I just want to apologize to the judges for not properly introducing you earlier. I think it was an item that got lost in our rather long running order. So just to close out the debate, just want to say a huge thank you to all of our judges, and I will give them each their due introduction now. So our first judge was this evening was Shreya Nanda. Shreya is an economist working in the Center for Economic Justice. She joined the IPPR, Institute for Public Policy Research, in 2019. And before that, she was part of the Government Economic Service, providing advice and analysis on housing, transport, and food standards. She has experience of analytical techniques, including cost-benefit analysis, forecasting, impact assessment, and regression analysis. She has also worked on research on international development for the Africa All-Party Parliamentary Group, the World Health Organization, and at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. Shreya has particular interest in land and economic rent. And our second judge this evening was Laurie McFarlane. Laurie McFarlane is the economics editor at Open Democracy, an independent global media platform covering world affairs, ideas, and culture, which seeks to challenge power and encourage democratic debate. Laurie is also a research associate at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Prior to this, Laurie was a senior economist at the New Economics Foundation. He is the co-author of the critically acclaimed book, Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing, which was listed by the Financial Times as one of the best economics books of 2017. Laurie regularly discusses economic issues in the media, including on Sky News, Channel 4 News, BBC World, and BBC Radio 4, and is also a trustee at the Finance Innovation Lab. So our third judge this evening was Brian O'Donovan. Brian O'Donovan is the current Washington correspondent for RT News, having held the role since January 2018. O'Donovan began his broadcasting career with Cork radio station Red FM in 2002. 3 years later, he made the move to television when he joined TV3 News. Over the next 10 years, he held various positions, including news reporter, finance correspondent, and documentary maker. In 2015, O'Donovan joined RT News, where he worked as a multimedia journalist reporting across television and radio news. And since then, he has reported on major international news stories, including the aftermath of the 2016 Nice truck attack, the plight of Syrians in refugee camps near the Jordan-Syrian border, the verdict of the Molly Martin's Corbett trial in North Carolina, and on the Catalan independence protests in Spain. And of course, our final judge and chair of public business this evening was Baroness Natalie Bennett, or Natalie Bennett, as I think she prefers. She's a politician and journalist who served as leader of the Green Party of England and Wales from 2012 to 2016, leading the party to a result in the 2015 general election that totaled more votes than in all of the previous general elections added together. As leader, she was also the first Green to take part in the national television debates that year. Natalie continues to work full-time in politics, particularly focused on the North and the Midlands, with lots of her time taken up with supporting the anti-fracking movement. Natalie was appointed to the House of Lords, joining Jenny Jones to become the second Green peer in September 2019. Born and raised in Australia, she started her career as a journalist in rural New South Wales and has worked for the Bangkok Post, the Telegraph, and the Independent, the Times, and spent 5 years as editor of the Guardian Weekly. So thank you so much to all of our absolutely wonderful judges. And I hope that I hope that we've given you finally the introduction that you deserved. And perhaps a round of applause again for the judges. And back to Breed.
Excellent. I now would like to call upon Emma from the Student Economics Fund, Economics Review to address the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Reid. I just wanted to say thank you all for coming, and particularly our judges and our speakers from Yale and the transatlantic debacle going on tonight. And having three continents involved has been really great. And I just want to thank you all for engaging as well in a discussion about economics, and particularly this policy area, because I think it's very important and has become increasingly important over many years. And also a big shout out to Maggie for all her help organising this debate. And yeah, I can't wait to see the collaborations in the future, which will hopefully be in person. I'd really love to see Yale over in Dublin sometime in the future.
Thanks so much, Emma. And again, I'd like to thank the Student Economics Review for collaborating with us. It's always a pleasure every year to be working with them, and we look forward to future collaborations. And also thank you again to not only our esteemed guests, but also the wonderful speakers from Yale. And also I'd like to thank also the Trinity speakers, both the floor speakers and the amazing team, and just thank you to everyone who engaged in this debate. It was really fantastic. And yes, we have an afters this evening in a separate Zoom call. So I just posted the link in there. Feel free to join that. We'll be playing Code Word and a couple of other games. It should be good fun. I also want to just point out that next week we have the Harneys final, which should be really excellent. Another competitive debate. So really high standard of speakers. So I invite everyone to come along to that. We also have a Regency Ball happening next Tuesday evening. It's a Zoom ball. It should be very exciting. Feel free to dress up in your favorite corset, I guess. And also on Friday, we have a Derby of Rhetoric. So if you have a topic like universal basic income or another economics related topic that you love and you just hyper fixate on, feel free to come along to this Derby of Rhetoric. We will give you 7 minutes to basically talk to your heart's content about it. So feel free to come along to that. That's happening at noon on Friday over Zoom. You can find all these events on our Facebook as well as our Instagram. So yeah, lots happening. And again, thank you to everyone who attended and who's still here. And again, thank you to all our amazing guests and speakers this evening. Fantastic debate. I'm honestly blown away. I don't study economics, but honestly, that was fantastic. But yeah, thank you so much, guys. Oh, wait, I should cede the floor back to the chair to officially adjourn this evening. I believe Nad, but yeah. I think
okay. So, sorry, I had relaxed already. Okay. I now call the